Picture this. It's around 1450 BC, on the island of Crete, in the middle of the shimmering Aegean Sea, a civilization is thriving. Massive palaces sprawl across the landscape, decorated with vibrant frescoes of dolphins and bull leapers, and processions of nobles in flowing robes. Merchant ships crisscross the Mediterranean, carrying pottery and olive oil and copper to Egypt, to the Levant, to mainland Greece. This is a sophisticated society, organised, wealthy, artistic centuries ahead of most of its neighbours. This is the Minoans, and most historians agree they were Europe's very first great civilization. The palace at Knossos alone covers over 6 acres, with plumbing systems and storage magazines that wouldn't feel out of place 1,000 years later. And then, seemingly overnight, it's gone. Palaces across the island lie in ruins. Entire towns are abandoned, left as empty shells. The elegant script the Minoans used for record-keeping disappears from history entirely. Within a generation or two, the people who once dominated the Aegean have vanished from the historical record almost as completely as if the sea had simply swallowed them whole. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Nearly a century of archaeology, geology, and scientific analysis later, we still don't fully agree on what happened. Was it a volcano so violent it altered the climate of the ancient world? Was it a tsunami that drowned coastal cities in minutes? Was it invasion? Opportunistic conquerors sweeping in while the Minoans were already staggering? Or was it something far messier, a perfect storm of disasters stacking on top of each other, until a civilization that had thrived for over 1,000 years simply couldn't hold on anymore? If you're listening to this while drifting off to sleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right there. I genuinely check the comments, and it's wild seeing it Sydney at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, Lisbon somewhere in between, all listening to the same ancient mystery at completely different moments in their day. And if you want an easy way to keep these coming, following the show on Spotify is honestly the best way to support it. Links in the description whenever you get a chance. Now, back to Crete. Because what happened to the Minoans isn't just some dusty academic debate. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world, sitting right at the intersection of archaeology and volcanology and forensic science. We're talking about a volcanic eruption so catastrophic it may have been one of the largest in human history, an eruption whose ash rained down for miles, and whose shockwaves may have sent tsunamis crashing into Crete's northern shores. We're talking about a buried city, frozen in volcanic ash like a Bronze Age Pompeii, giving us an eerie snapshot of daily life the moment before disaster struck. We're talking about earthquakes, invasions, climate disruption, and clues written in a script nobody has ever fully deciphered. Over the next while, we're going to walk through all of it. The golden age of Minoan Crete, the volcano that may have doomed it, the tsunami theory, the invasion theory, and the evidence that keeps scientists arguing to this day. Because somewhere between the ash and the ruins and the silence of a lost language, there's an answer. We just haven't fully found it yet. So let's go back to where it all began. Because to understand how something falls, you first have to understand how high it climbed. Crete sits in almost the perfect spot on the map. If you were a Bronze Age trader trying to build an empire out of pottery and ambition, it's a long, narrow island stretched across the mouth of the Aegean Sea, close enough to mainland Greece to trade with the emerging powers there, close enough to Egypt and the Levant to plug into the wealthiest, most sophisticated economies of the ancient world, and close enough to Anatolia to pull in goods and ideas from Asia Minor. It's basically a bridge, a stepping stone sitting right in the middle of the Mediterranean's busiest trade routes. And the Minoans figured out early on that controlling that bridge meant controlling the flow of wealth itself. Now, people had been living on Crete for thousands of years before anything resembling a civilization emerged. Archaeologists have found evidence of Neolithic farming settlements going back to around 7000 BC, simple communities growing wheat and barley, raising goats and sheep, probably not all that different from farming villages anywhere else in the early Mediterranean world. But something started to shift around 3000 BC. Small settlements began growing larger. Trade networks started to stretch further. And by around 2000 BC, something genuinely new appeared on the landscape: the first palaces. This is usually where historians mark the true beginning of Minoan civilization, what scholars call the proto-palatial period, roughly 2000 to 1700 BC. Massive multi-story complexes started rising up at Knossos, at Phaistos, at Malea. These weren't just big houses for important families. They were entire administrative centres, combining royal residences, religious shrines, storage facilities, workshops, and record-keeping all under one roof, or more accurately, under dozens of roofs connected by a maze of corridors and courtyards. Around 1700 BC, a series of earthquakes seems to have levelled the first generation of palaces. But instead of collapsing as a civilization, the Minoans just rebuilt bigger. This kicks off what's called the Neopalatial period, roughly 1700 to 1450 BC, which is widely considered the peak of Minoan civilization, the golden age we'll dig into properly in the next section. But here's the thing that makes the Minoans genuinely remarkable, not just another Bronze Age society among many. Most historians consider them Europe's first advanced urban civilization. Not the first humans in Europe, obviously. Not even the first farmers. But the first society on the European continent to develop cities in the true sense, with monumental architecture, centralized administration, organized bureaucracy, a written language for record-keeping, and complex economic systems that moved goods across hundreds of miles of open water. Nothing quite like it existed anywhere else in Europe at the time. While much of the continent was still organized around small farming villages and scattered tribal communities, Crete had multi-story palaces with indoor plumbing, drainage systems, light wells for natural illumination, and storage magazines capable of holding enough olive oil and grain to feed thousands of people through a bad harvest year. It's honestly kind of staggering to think about when you put it side by side with what else was happening in Europe at the same time. And Knossos was the crown jewel of this whole system. We touched on it briefly already, but it's worth sitting with the scale of the place. Over 6 acres of interconnected rooms, corridors, storerooms and courtyards, home to what was probably several thousand people at its peak, decorated with those famous frescoes of leaping bulls and processions and marine life that make Minoan art instantly recognizable even today. But Knossos wasn't alone. Phaistos, on the southern side of the island, was nearly as impressive, with its own palace complex overlooking the fertile Mezara plain. Malea sat on the northern coast, controlling its own slice of trade and agriculture. And Zakros, tucked away on the eastern tip of the island, functioned as a crucial trading outpost, probably one of the main points of contact with the Near East. Judging by the exotic imported goods archaeologists have pulled out of its ruins, ivory, bronze, even fragments of elephant tusks. 4 major palace centres, each functioning almost like a regional capital, all sharing a common culture, a common artistic style, and probably some form of shared religious and political system, even though we're still not entirely sure how power was actually distributed between them. Was Knossos the capital of the whole island, with the other palaces answering to it? Or were these more like independent city-states, cooperating and competing the way Greek polis would centuries later? Honestly, scholars still argue about this, and we don't have a definitive answer. What we do know is how the Minoans built their wealth, and it really comes down to 3 things: agriculture, seafaring, and craft production. Crete's landscape, with its fertile valleys and Mediterranean climate, was perfect for growing olives and grapes, which the Minoans turned into two of their most valuable exports, olive oil and wine. Massive storage jars called pithoi, some taller than a grown adult, have been found by the hundreds in palace storerooms, evidence of a system built for storing and redistributing agricultural surplus on a massive scale. But agriculture alone doesn't explain Minoan wealth. The real engine was the sea. The Minoans built one of the most sophisticated maritime trading networks in the ancient Mediterranean, sending ships loaded with pottery, textiles, and that valuable olive oil to Egypt, to Cyprus, to the Levantine coast, to mainland Greece, and bringing back copper, ivory, precious stones, and exotic luxury goods in return. And layered on top of that was craft production, extraordinary pottery, intricate jewellery, carved stone vessels, and metalwork that shows a level of artistic skill that genuinely rivals anything else being produced in the Bronze Age world. Now, here's a fun little wrinkle before we move on. We don't actually know what the Minoans called themselves. The name Minoan wasn't used by the people who built these palaces. It was invented thousands of years later by Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist, who excavated Knossos in the early 1900s, and we'll get into his story properly a little later. Evans named the civilization after King Minos, the legendary ruler from Greek mythology, the king said to have kept a monstrous half-man, half-bull creature, the Minotaur, trapped inside a massive labyrinth beneath his palace. When Evans uncovered the sprawling maze-like corridors of Knossos, the connection seemed almost too perfect to ignore. So the name stuck, which means, quite literally, the label we use for Europe's first great civilization comes from a myth, not from the Minoans themselves. Their real name for themselves, whatever it was, is just one more thing lost to time. And that, it turns out, is going to be a recurring theme in this story. When we talk about the Minoan Golden Age, we're really talking about a couple of centuries where everything seems to click at once. Architecture, trade, art, religion, politics, all feeding into each other and amplifying the power of this island that, on paper, should have been too small to matter as much as it did. Start with the palaces. Calling them palaces almost undersells what they were. These were not just big, fancy houses for a royal family. They were more like living machines for managing an entire society. At Knossos, in the Neo-Palatial period, you're looking at a sprawling labyrinth of maybe 1,000 rooms, arranged around a huge central courtyard. Multiple stories high in places, built with carefully cut ashlar blocks, supported by wooden beams designed to flex during earthquakes. Light wells channeled sunlight deep into the interior. Staircases wound up and down between levels. Corridors suddenly opened into wide halls lined with painted columns, red shafts that tapered downward in that distinctive Minoan style. And water. The Minoans were almost obsessive about water. They had terracotta pipes running under floors, carrying fresh water into the complex and wastewater out, sometimes even with rudimentary flushing toilets and bathtubs. Drains, gutters, settling basins. They engineered the flow of water with a level of care that wouldn't really be matched in Europe for more than 1,000 years after they were gone. This wasn't some crude pile of stone. It was an integrated, planned environment where architecture, engineering, and daily life were all part of one coherent system. Inside those walls, the economy came together. Long, narrow magazines lined with rows of pithoi, stored grain, oil, wine, honey, dried figs. Workshops produced textiles, bronze tools and weapons, perfumed oils, carved stone vessels. Scribes scratched records onto clay tablets in Linear A, tracking who owed what where surplus was going, what was coming in from overseas. Even if we can't read the language yet, the pattern of the tablets makes it clear. These were bureaucrats, and they were busy. And that bureaucracy was plugged into a trading world that stretched far beyond the horizon. We know Minoan ships were reaching Egypt because Egyptian tombs from the 18th dynasty show foreigners bringing what looks suspiciously like Minoan goods, fine, stirrup-handled jars, elegant cups, maybe even textiles. Minoan-style pottery has been found at sites along the Levantine coast, in Cyprus, on islands scattered across the Aegean, and on mainland Greece. In some places we find local imitations of Minoan designs, which usually means the originals were so desirable people tried to copy them. Trade, of course, went both ways. At Minoan sites we find Egyptian scarabs, faience beads, pieces of ivory, Near Eastern cylinder seals, copper from Cyprus, perhaps tin from further afield to make bronze. These things didn't walk to Crete by themselves. They rode on ships, and those ships needed harbours, crews, navigational knowledge, and enough political stability that merchants could risk sending valuable cargo across open water and expect a profit. Out of that came visible wealth, and the Minoans made absolutely sure you could see it. Palace walls were covered in frescoes, not just in throne rooms or sacred spaces, but along corridors, staircases, reception halls. We get scenes of bull leapers somersaulting over charging animals, elegant women in flounced skirts and open bodices, young men with shaved heads and long locks, processions carrying offerings, dolphins and octopuses swimming across blue backgrounds. Even the everyday objects radiate sophistication. Eggshell-thin cups, polychrome pottery with swirling marine motifs, gold jewellery with tiny granulated details that would be hard to reproduce without magnification, sealstones carved on a scale so small it's easy to miss how technically impressive they are. This was not a subsistence economy scraping by. This was a society rich enough and organised enough to devote enormous time and resources to things that were not strictly necessary for survival. Art, ornament, ritual, display, all signs of people confident in their position. And that brings us to one of the strangest features of the Minoan Golden Age, what you don't see. Massive city walls, fortress towers, defensive ramparts encircling the palaces. For much of their peak period, the main Minoan centres show almost no evidence of the big, intimidating fortifications you find in places like Mycenae or Hattusa. Now, this doesn't mean Crete was naive or totally unprotected. There were natural defences in the island's rugged terrain, and some later sites do show more concern with fortification. But overall, the absence of early large-scale walls is striking enough that scholars have been arguing about it for over a century. One interpretation is that the Minoans felt secure. Maybe Crete's position and naval power made large invasions difficult. Maybe there was a relatively peaceful political order in the Central Aegean for a while. Another line of thought is that their power was the sea itself. Ancient Greek traditions later talked about a Minoan thalassocracy, a sea empire that supposedly controlled the Aegean and cleared it of pirates. We can't verify those stories directly, but the archaeological pattern does fit a society leaning heavily on maritime strength rather than land fortresses. If you control the ships, the harbours and the islands along the routes, you don't necessarily need massive walls. You just need to make sure enemies never get close. How that power was structured on land is still an open question. Some historians imagine a kind of centralized kingdom with Knossos at the top, coordinating the other palatial centres in something like a unified state. Others see a more decentralized network of regional powers, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, bound together by shared religion and culture, maybe even dynastic marriages, but each with its own internal authority. There are also theories that religious institutions, priesthoods or cult centres played a bigger role in governance than later, more militarized Bronze Age states. The throne room at Knossos, with its lustral basins and frescoes of griffins, may have been as much a ritual space as a political one. Whatever the exact structure, the scale of urban life at Knossos hints at the complexity involved. Estimates vary, but many scholars think the city around the palace may have supported tens of thousands of people at its height, if you include the wider settlement area. Narrow streets, densely packed houses, workshops clustered around the central complex, all feeding labour, goods and information into the palace heart. You have to coordinate food supply, building projects, religious festivals, craft production, foreign trade, and probably taxation. That implies administrators, scribes, specialized artisans, dockworkers, priests, and a hierarchy capable of telling thousands of people what to do and getting at least some of them to listen. In other words, by the mid-2nd millennium BC, Crete had become something rare in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, an island whose influence reached far beyond its shores, powered not primarily by armies but by ships, storage jars, and the ability to turn agricultural surplus into political power. And it's exactly this level of integration, this delicate web of palaces, trade routes, and centralized control that makes what happens next so puzzling. Because when you build a system this complex, you don't just need wealth to keep it going. You need resilience. And the evidence suggests that at some point, that resilience failed. For most of history, all of this was invisible. The palaces, the pipes, the frescoes, the storerooms full of pithoi, it was all just gone, buried under meters of soil, scrub, and later farmhouses. Ancient Greeks still told stories about a powerful king named Minos, a monstrous minotaur, and a sprawling labyrinth somewhere on Crete, but nobody could point to an actual place and say, here, this is where it was. By the late 19th century, that started to change. Travellers and local farmers near the modern village of Knossos kept turning up odd things, worked stones, bits of painted plaster, fragments of large jars. A few archaeologists suspected something big lay under the low hill called Kefala. The problem was the land was privately owned. The Ottoman authorities weren't keen on major excavations, and nobody had yet put all the clues together into a coherent picture. Enter Arthur Evans. Evans was a British scholar, former newspaper correspondent, and curator of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. He was also the kind of person who did not think small, fascinated by ancient scripts and the origins of Greek civilization. He became convinced there was an older, pre-Greek culture hidden beneath the myths. When he arrived on Crete in the 1890s, he was already looking for evidence of that lost world. In 1900, after years of negotiation, he finally bought the Kefala Hill and began digging. What he found escalated fast. Within weeks, walls started to emerge. Corridors, staircases, storage rooms choked with broken pithoi, coloured plaster clinging stubbornly to damp stone. Then more floors below those, more rooms behind those. The deeper his team went, the bigger the puzzle became. Evans realised he wasn't uncovering a simple building. He was peeling back the layers of a vast, multi-storey complex that matched uncomfortably well the Greek stories about a palace, so confusing it became synonymous with a maze. In his mind, the connection snapped into place. This, he thought, must be the palace of King Minos. The people who built it needed a name. He gave them one: Minoans. That single act, naming matters more than it sounds. Before Evans, these ruins were just another Bronze Age site. After Evans, they became the home of a specific, almost legendary civilization with a personality. Graceful, seafaring, artistic, maybe even unusually peaceful. A lot of that personality came less from the stones themselves and more from how Evans chose to interpret them. Because Evans didn't just excavate Knossos, he rebuilt parts of it. At the turn of the 20th century, archaeological method was still catching up with modern standards. Stratigraphy, careful recording, minimal intervention. All of that was being developed, but not everyone followed the same playbook. Evans worked quickly, sometimes aggressively. He cleared huge areas, sorted finds on the fly, and then made a decision that would define Knossos for the next century. He started to restore. When his team discovered traces of painted columns, he didn't leave them as stumps. He had workers recreate them in concrete, painting them a vivid red with black capitals, set against cream-coloured walls. When they found pieces of fresco, fragments the size of your hand, he hired artists to reconstruct entire wall paintings from them, extrapolating missing sections based on style and guesswork. In some places he rebuilt staircases, rooms, and even whole upper floors that had long since vanished, guided by his own understanding of how the building must have looked. To visitors, this was mesmerizing. You weren't staring at bare foundations and trying to imagine the rest. You were walking through what felt like a living Bronze Age palace, coloured columns, reconstructed throne room, gleaming plaster. Knossos became one of the first archaeological sites in the world where the past wasn't just uncovered, it was actively recreated. But that's exactly why Evans remains such a controversial figure. On one hand, without his energy, money, and sheer determination, Knossos might still be a quiet hill outside a Cretan village. His work brought the Minoans into public consciousness, generated enormous interest in Aegean prehistory, and preserved thousands of artifacts that might otherwise have crumbled away. On the other hand, his reconstructions blur the line between evidence and imagination. Many of the famous frescoes at Knossos are modern paintings stitching together small ancient fragments with large areas of speculative filler. Those iconic red columns, concrete, not original wood. Some wall heights, room functions, and architectural details reflect Evans's early 20th century ideas about what a palace civilization ought to look like, more than what the stratigraphy strictly demanded. Critics argue that he romanticized the Minoans. He saw them as refined, almost utopian, an elegant, female-centered sea-loving culture in contrast to the more warlike Mycenaeans of mainland Greece. The relative absence of early fortifications on Crete fit his narrative of a peaceful thalassocracy. The lively, colourful art seemed to him less obsessed with death and conquest than Egyptian or Mesopotamian imagery. From this he inferred a society that was gentler, freer, even more modern in its attitudes. The problem is, those interpretations can easily outrun the data. Later finds like weapons, signs of social stratification, and evidence of violent destruction layers complicate the portrait. What we see at Knossos could represent only the elite's public face, not the whole truth about Minoan life. And some of the features Evans emphasized as evidence of harmony might simply reflect gaps in what has survived. Still, beneath all the concrete and speculation, the excavations at Knossos did reveal a lot about how this society actually functioned day to day. Evans's teams uncovered long magazines stacked with storage jars, confirming that palaces were economic hubs, not just royal residences. They found scribal rooms with clay tablets, bull-shaped writer used in ritual drinking, workshops for stone vase carving and metalworking, domestic quarters with hearths and benches. They revealed the complex's circulation system, narrow service corridors, broad ceremonial halls, hidden staircases leading to what might have been storerooms or private suites. They traced the water management system, those terracotta pipes and drains, proving just how much engineering went into making daily life comfortable and controlled. They also exposed the administrative skeleton of the place. Rooms packed with ceilings, tablet deposits, and standardized storage spaces showed that whoever ran Knossos was tracking goods meticulously. Even though we can't yet read Linear A, the quantity and organization of the tablets point to a bureaucratic apparatus that was deeply embedded in ordinary life. rations, offerings, deliveries, labour assignments, all flowing through this administrative machine. And Evans's interpretations, problematic as some are, left a deep imprint on how the rest of us think about the Minoans. For over a century, school books, museum displays, and popular imagination have borrowed his language and his imagery. The Minoan civilization, the labyrinth, the bull leapers, the idea of a palace culture that was somehow different, lighter, more fluid than the fortress states around it. Even today, when archaeologists are far more cautious and quick to criticize Evans's restorations, most of us still picture Knossos through the lens he helped create. When you imagine those colourful walls and agile acrobats, you're seeing a hybrid, part ancient Crete, part early 20th century British fantasy about what a lost civilization ought to have been. And that matters, because when we ask how this world collapsed, we're not just dealing with broken stones and burned layers. We're also wrestling with a century's worth of stories layered on top of them. Stories that began the moment Arthur Evans decided he had found the Palace of Minos and gave a nameless Bronze Age culture a mythic identity. To get closer to the real people beneath that myth, we have to go beyond the big palace and its concrete columns, into the more intimate spaces of Minoan life. Their gods, their rituals, their fears, and the strange bull-haunted symbols that saturate their art. If you peel away the concrete and the Edwardian fantasies, what's left in Minoan culture is surprisingly consistent. Again and again in frescoes, seal stones, carved rings, and tiny votive figures, the same themes keep surfacing. The first is the bull. You've probably seen the famous bull leaping scene from Knossos, a charging bull, its back arched mid-stride, and 3 human figures interacting with it in impossible ways. One at the front, apparently grasping its horns. One in mid-air, flipping over its back. One behind, landing or waiting. Archaeologists argue about what, exactly, we're looking at. Is this a literal athletic performance? A stylized ritual? A symbolic image never meant to represent something that actually happened? The bodies are elongated, elastic, almost weightless. The bull is huge, powerful, and strangely abstract. There's no crowd, no obvious arena, no blood. If it was sport, it wasn't sport as we know it. Most scholars think we're seeing some kind of ritual performance where danger and grace, animal strength and human agility were all part of a religious drama. Whatever it was, it mattered. Bull leaping appears not only at Knossos, but across Crete and even on the mainland in Minoan-influenced sites. Bulls are everywhere in their material culture. Horns carved in stone and set up on roofs and altars. Bullhead writer used for pouring liquids in ceremonies. Tiny seals showing humans grappling with or standing beside them. You get the sense that for the Minoans, the bull wasn't just an animal. It was a bridge between human and divine, between the orderly world of palaces and the raw power of nature. The second recurring presence is harder to pin down, but just as pervasive, a dominant female figure. On rings in fresco fragments, on little terracotta figurines, we see elaborately dressed women standing on mountain tops flanked by lions, or rising above shrines. In some scenes, smaller figures approach them with offerings. In others, they appear in gardens or on rooftops, or in what look like sacred enclosures. Sometimes snakes coil around their arms, sometimes doves perch on their headdresses. Evans looked at all this and decided he was seeing a great goddess, maybe even a whole pantheon of goddesses, presiding over a female-centered religion. Later scholars have been much more cautious. We don't know their names. We don't know their myths. We don't even know if we're seeing one deity in many guises, several distinct ones, or a mixture of goddesses and human priestesses being depicted with similar visual language. But the pattern is hard to ignore. Whatever else Minoan religion involved, powerful female figures are front and centre in the iconography. Men are there, bare-chested, kilted, sometimes armed with spears in hunting scenes, or participating in rituals. But they don't dominate the religious imagery the way male gods and warrior kings do in many Near Eastern cultures of the same period. That has led to a long-running debate. Was Minoan society matriarchal? Evans and some early 20th century writers went all in on this idea. To them, the combination of prominent women in art, supposed goddess worship, and the lack of obvious fortifications added up to a peaceful, female-led utopia. Modern archaeologists are not convinced. There's no clear evidence that political power was held by women as a class. The palaces, tombs, and administrative systems don't scream reverse gender hierarchy. What the evidence does suggest is that elite women had highly visible roles, especially in religious and ceremonial contexts. We see them in procession, on thrones, in front-row positions at rituals. Men appear too, often in similar scale and dress. So instead of a tidy matriarchy, many scholars now lean towards some form of complex, possibly fairly egalitarian elite culture where gender roles were different from later Greek norms but not necessarily flipped. And then there's the style in which all of this is shown. Compared to the stiff, regimented poses of Egyptian art, or the dense, narrative reliefs of Mesopotamia, Minoan painting feels almost shockingly alive. Figures twist, run, and leap. Hair flies, fabrics cling and billow. Dolphins arc through blue water in fluid curves. Plants bend naturally, not as botanical diagrams, but as things that move in wind and light. Colour is used boldly. Backgrounds can be intense blue or red. Human skin follows a convention. Men darker, women lighter. But within that, there's a playfulness and variation that suggests the artists were less concerned with rigid rules than with capturing movement and rhythm. This isn't realism, but it is naturalism, an interest in how bodies and animals actually occupy space. Even small seal stones barely larger than a fingernail can show incredible detail. Tiny acrobats, miniature bulls, micro-landscapes. It all adds up to a culture that poured a lot of energy into visual expression, into making things look and feel dynamic. From this art, and from the actual objects left behind, we can sketch the outlines of everyday life. Clothing, for instance, is reasonably well attested. Women in frescoes and figurines wear flounced skirts and tightly fitted bodices that leave the breasts exposed. Whether that was everyday wear or ritual costume is debated, but it clearly belonged to a sophisticated textile tradition. Men wear kilts or loincloths, sometimes codpieces, sometimes elaborate belts. Both sexes adorn themselves with jewellery, necklaces, bracelets, elaborate hair. Food comes into focus through animal bones, plant remains and all those storage jars. The Minoan diet seems to have been based on cereals like barley and wheat, pulses, olives, grapes, and a lot of seafood, plus sheep and goat products, meat, milk, cheese, wool. Wine and olive oil were probably both staples and major trade goods. Specialized tools suggest bread baking, beer or wine making, and complex cooking, not just boiling things in a pot. Social structure scales up from household shrines to town layouts to palatial complexes. You see small farmsteads, villages, larger towns, and then the big palace centres that function as economic and religious hubs. There are clear status differences. Some houses are bigger, some graves richer, some objects made of precious imported materials. But the architecture inside palaces includes suites, workrooms, storage, and ceremonial spaces all intertwined, hinting at an elite that lived and administered and worshipped in the same sprawling complexes. And over all of this hangs one last, very strange absence. In hundreds of years of excavation, Minoan art has yielded almost no clear, unambiguous depictions of organised warfare. You can find weapons, swords, daggers, spearheads, arrowheads. You can find scenes of hunting on some later seals and fresco fragments. There are ships that might be warships, and a few damaged or ambiguous scenes that might show conflict. But there is nothing like the triumphal battle scenes carved across Mesopotamian stelae or marching phalanxes on Egyptian temple walls. What does that mean? Evans thought it proved the Minoans were uniquely peaceful, ruling a sea empire through trade and prestige rather than force. Many modern scholars are sceptical of that romantic image. The presence of weapons, the strategic placement of sites, and the later history of the Aegean all suggest that violence was part of the picture. But the iconographic gap is still there. Either they chose not to celebrate war in their public art, or we've simply lost the contexts where those images would have appeared. Maybe their elite identity was framed more around ritual, nature, and athleticism than around conquest. Maybe power was expressed through control of ceremonies and redistribution of goods rather than monuments to defeated enemies. Whichever way you read it, the combination is odd, a culture obsessed with bulls and goddesses, masters of colour and movement, leaving us almost no clear bragging about battles. It's a world that feels familiar enough to grasp, but alien enough to keep slipping away. And that matters, because when we get to the moment of collapse, all these choices, the rituals they performed, the gods they trusted, the things they valued enough to paint on their walls and carve into stone, will shape not only how they lived, but how they responded when their world started to break. All of this vivid imagery, all of this movement and colour and ritual, tempts you to think you really know the Minoans. And then you run straight into the wall that stops everyone. They had writing. They were literate. They were keeping records, tagging offerings, marking ownership, probably composing prayers or hymns. We just can't read a word of it. The main script the Minoans used is what we call Linear A. It shows up on clay tablets, on ceilings used to close jars and doors, on little votive objects, even on stone libation tables. Neat rows of signs written left to right in an orderly system that clearly meant something to the people who used it. We can count the signs, roughly 90 core symbols, plus some variants and logograms. We can trace how it's written. We can see that numbers and fractions are there, that some symbols behave like syllables, others like whole words. This isn't some crude proto-scribbling. It's a mature, well-developed script used in complex palace bureaucracies. And yet, after more than a century of study, Linear A is still undeciphered. That might sound strange because on the same island, in the same palaces, another script was found that looks very similar. Linear B. Linear B was used a few centuries later when Mycenaean Greeks were running the show in places like Knossos. It's clearly descended from Linear A. Many signs are visually almost identical, but the language underneath is different. When Michael Ventris cracked Linear B in the 1950s, the big surprise was that it turned out to be Greek. Not Homeric, poetic Greek, but a bureaucratic Bronze Age version of it. Once Linear B fell, people assumed Linear A would quickly follow. Same basic sign shapes, same general structure, same kinds of documents. Surely it was just a matter of applying the values we now knew from Linear B to the earlier script. That's exactly what they tried, and the result wasn't nonsense. When you force Linear B sound values onto Linear A signs, you don't get meaningful Greek. You don't even get something that looks like a related Indo-European language hiding in there. Instead, you get strings of sounds that refuse to resolve into anything recognizable. Whatever language the Minoans were writing, it wasn't Greek. It wasn't Hittite. It wasn't anything we can easily plug into our existing family trees. That's the core of the problem. With Egyptian hieroglyphs, we had the Rosetta Stone. the same text in hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. With Linear B, we eventually realized the underlying language was one we already knew, just in an archaic form. With Linear A, we have neither a bilingual text nor a clear guess at the language family. We're staring at a code without the key, written in a tongue that has no obvious living or well-attested relatives. So how do we know anything at all? Mostly from context and comparison. Linear. Inscriptions cluster in specific places. In the palaces, they're overwhelmingly administrative. Clay tablets list commodities, place names, personal names and numbers. Olive oil, wine, figs, wool, metal, livestock, all moving in and out of storerooms and workshops. You see entries grouped under headings, totals at the bottom, repeated formulae. It looks a lot like Linear B archives, except that the words in between the numbers stay stubbornly opaque. Outside the palaces, some inscriptions show up in clearly religious settings. Stone offering tables with carved channels for liquids bear short texts in Linear A, probably dedicatory formulas. Small votive objects and cult equipment are inscribed too. Certain words recur only in these contexts, leading scholars to suspect they might be divine names, titles, or ritual terms. There are even a few longer pieces that look tantalizingly close to real texts. A repeated phrase that might be a prayer, a sequence that could be a litany, but with no way to tie sound to meaning. It's all hypothesis stacked on hypothesis. We can map patterns without filling in the content. We know, for instance, that the script seems to represent a language with different structure than Greek. Some consonant-vowel combinations are common, others almost absent, suggesting a sound system with its own quirks. The way signs cluster hints at particular syllable shapes, but that's like knowing the rhythm of a song without understanding the lyrics. The contrast with Linear B makes this even more maddening. On the Mycenaean tablets, we can read the titles of officials, the names of gods, the lists of chariots and armour. We see a palace economy itemizing rations, taxing communities, assigning workers. We can even see how the Mycenaeans pronounced certain words centuries before classical Greek. For the Minoans, who invented the script family in the first place, we get fragments. Quantity of something from place X, such and such, delivered. Maybe offering for unknown deity. It's like having the filing cabinets of a vanished corporation, all properly labelled and indexed, and being unable to understand the language on the folders. That gap haunts everything about how we talk about Minoan civilization. We stare at scenes of bull leaping and processions and goddess-like figures, and we can't check our guesses against their own words. We don't know what they called those rituals, what myths they told to explain them, what rules governed who participated. We don't know how they named their gods, what they prayed for, how they justified power or property or hierarchy. Even basic things. Was there a single king at Knossos? Were there palace priests? How did they refer to themselves versus outsiders? Are locked behind those little incised lines. And then, when the civilization starts to unravel, Linear A stays silent. We can't read a decree responding to an earthquake. We can't see a religious reform, or a change in tax policy, or a record of war losses, even if some version of those texts once existed. The administrative tablets that do survive were often fired accidentally in the same fires that destroyed the buildings around them. They freeze a moment in time, but we don't know if that moment was business as usual, crisis management, or the last frantic accounting before everything fell apart. Some scholars have floated the hope that one day, somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, a bilingual inscription will emerge, linear side by side with Egyptian or Hittite or Akkadian. Until that happens, the Minoans remain a major Bronze Age power whose own voice is reduced to shapes we can copy but not fully hear. And that matters when we try to explain their end. Because we're going to be forced to rely on what others wrote about them, later Greeks, myth-makers, distant neighbours, or on mute layers of ash and rubble. The people at the centre of the story left a script that runs through their palaces, their shrines, their warehouses, and then drops into unreadable silence right as their world is coming apart. The mystery of Linear A isn't just a fun side puzzle. It's a locked door in the middle of the Minoan collapse. We can see the smoke seeping out around the frame. We just can't yet hear what the people inside were saying as everything started to go wrong. So we turn from those silent tablets to the only voice we can still hear clearly: the dirt. When archaeologists talk about the end of Minoan civilization, they're not thinking of a single burned palace or a slow fade into poverty. They're looking at a particular band of earth that shows up again and again across Crete and the surrounding islands. Dig down through the later layers, past Hellenistic houses and Roman floors and Byzantine chapels, and eventually you hit late Minoan I, roughly the 15th century BC. In a shocking number of places, that level ends the same way, with fire, at sites all across Crete, Phaistos in the south, Malea and Gornia in the north, Catastrophe in the far east, smaller towns and villas tucked into valleys and perched on hillsides. You reach a horizon of destruction, charred beams, collapsed upper stories, roof tiles vitrified by heat, storerooms where the pithoi, those massive storage jars, are shattered in place, their contents burnt or scattered. It's not just palaces, it's the whole landscape of a civilization catching fire. You see houses abandoned mid-use, workshops frozen with tools on the benches, pottery left where it stood on shelves or beside hearths. In some cases, human remains lying where people fell, not neatly buried, but caught under rubble. Archaeologists see these patterns, and they start asking time questions. Is this one bad year, a rough decade, a century of on and off trouble? The stratigraphy keeps pushing toward the sharper answer. The destruction layers at many of these sites belong to the same ceramic phase, the same style and sequence of pottery. That doesn't give you a precise calendar date, but it does tell you this: whatever happened, it hit a huge swath of Minoan Crete, within what, in human terms, is a single historical moment. Not a long, slow withering. A break. In a lot of places, that break is final. After the fires, some sites see only scattered reoccupation, if any. A few houses rebuilt cheaply over the ruins. A shepherd's hut where there used to be a thriving town. Sometimes, nothing at all. Just fallen walls left to be colonized by plants and goats. The palatial centers are especially telling. Take Phaistos. Before the end, it's one of the great nodes of Minoan power, a massive palace controlling the fertile Messara plain. In the destruction horizon, its magazines burn, its walls crack, its administrative life stops. Afterward, Phaistos never again regains its old status. There's activity in the area, sure, but the palace culture that once radiated from it is gone. Catastrophe, that eastern palace closely tied into Levantine trade, simply doesn't come back in anything like its earlier form. Gornia, a bustling town with a small palace, sees devastation and then a very different pattern of use. Over and over the same story: fire, collapse, and then a much thinner, poorer reoccupation, if any. And then there's Knossos. Knossos does burn. It takes damage. It shows evidence of violent upheaval. But unlike so many other sites, it doesn't die. It limps on, reorganizes, and in some ways becomes even more dominant. Only now, the fingerprints look different. In the layers after the Great Destruction, you start seeing changes in pottery style, in architecture, in the way administrative records are kept. Linear A tablets largely disappear. replaced eventually by linear B. The religious landscape shifts too. Some cult places stay in use, others change character, new symbols creep in. The impression is hard to escape. When the fires went out and rebuilding began, the people running Knossos were not the same cultural group that had built the old palaces. Knossos is the exception that proves the rule. It survives, but as the centre of something new, something that looks more Mycenaean than Minoan. Everywhere else, the destruction horizon feels like a full stop. And inside that horizon you see speed, rooms where luxury goods are smashed but not looted, storerooms where amphorae are toppled, not carefully emptied and repurposed, workshops where half-finished objects, pottery, stone vases, metalwork, are still in mid-production when the building burns down. You don't see a long, thrifty decline where people pour through the past, salvaging every useful thing. You don't see layers of repair and re-repair, broken floors patched, collapsed walls propped up for just a few more years of use. You see interruption. People did not have time to empty their warehouses, to move their household gods, to strip their palaces of reusable materials. In many places it looks like they fled or died fast, leaving life's debris behind: cooking pots, loom weights, personal ornaments, tools, administrative tablets baked hard in the very fires that ended the system they recorded. That's why archaeologists reach for phrases like civilization-ending event, because whatever debate there is, and there's plenty, about what exactly happened, the pattern is clear enough in the ground. In the span of a generation, maybe less, the palace system that had tied Crete together for centuries is smashed. The bureaucratic machine seizes up. The network of towns and villas feeding and feeding off that machine fractures or vanishes. If you were living on Crete around 1500 BC, you would grow up in a world defined by palaces, by Minoan art and ritual and administration. If you were born a few decades later, most of those centres would be ruins, and the one great palace that remained would be speaking with a new foreign-sounding voice. What we don't see in the layers is the cause written in big letters. We see fire, but not who lit it. We see collapse, but not whether the final blow came from beneath the ground, from across the sea, or from men with swords. We see Knossos standing amid the ashes, apparently under new management, but we don't see the moment when that transfer of power happened. All of that is why the destruction horizon around 1450 BC sits at the centre of the mystery. Something tore through Minoan Crete hard enough and fast enough to end a civilization and clear the way for new rulers. The dirt shows us the aftermath in excruciating detail. The real argument begins when we ask the next question: what exactly did this? To understand why so many people point at a volcano, you have to picture where the Minoans were living. Take Crete on a map. Now move your finger roughly 100 kilometers north into the Aegean. You hit a ring of islands, what we call Santorini today, but in the Bronze Age, Thera. That ring is not a normal island. It's the shattered rim of a volcano big enough to swallow cities. And sometime in the mid-2nd millennium BC, it went off. Not a picturesque red fountain of lava glowing against the night sky. Not a dusting of ash on your chariot kind of thing. The Thera eruption sits in the same league as Krakatoa in 1883, or even Tambora in 1815. The eruption that gave Europe the year without a summer. In terms of sheer violence, ash volume and energy released, it was one of the largest volcanic events in all of recorded human history. Before it blew, Thera was a tall, conical island with a bustling Minoan town, Akrotiri, on its flank, and smaller settlements scattered along its shores. It sat right on the maritime highway connecting Crete to the Cyclades, to mainland Greece, to Anatolia. When that volcano destabilized, the entire beating heart of the Minoan sea network was sitting almost next door. The eruption seems to have unfolded in stages, first months or years, of warning signs, tremors, fumaroles, venting gas, maybe small ash falls. We know the people of Akrotiri had time to react. Their town shows signs of orderly abandonment, not bodies trapped in panic like at Pompeii. Then came the main event. A colossal explosion rips the top off the island. Magma suddenly depressurized, flashes into gas, rock, ash, and pumice shoot tens of kilometers into the sky. A towering column punches into the stratosphere, visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. Within minutes to hours, that column starts collapsing under its own weight, and that's when things get apocalyptic. The column doesn't just fall straight down, it spills outward as pyroclastic flows, incandescent clouds of ash, gas, and rock fragments hurtling across the sea surface at highway speeds. Think ground-hugging avalanches of fire, hot enough to carbonize anything organic, dense enough to bulldoze buildings, lethal far beyond the island itself. Those pyroclastic flows racing into the water displace unimaginable volumes of sea. Combine that with the structural failure of the volcano itself, whole segments of the island slumping in, and you get the next piece of the disaster. The caldera collapses. Huge blocks of the island drop into the emptied magma chamber. The sea roars in to fill the void. All that movement transfers energy to the water column and sends waves radiating outward. Standing on northern Crete, you would not see Thera anymore. You would see the horizon deform, the sky darken, ash beginning to fall. If you were in a harbour, you might watch the sea first suck away from the shore, leaving ships stranded on the mud, fish flopping where there should be water followed by walls of water surging back in. Even leaving tsunamis aside, which we'll come back to in their own section, the immediate physical effects were brutal. Ash fall thick enough to bury fields and collapse roofs. Pumice rafts clogging harbours, making navigation hazardous or impossible. A choking sky that turns day to twilight as fine particles drift across the eastern Mediterranean. For people in the Bronze Age world with no concept of plate tectonics or caldera dynamics, this would have looked like the gods tearing the world open. So when archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began to realize that this wasn't just a local eruption, but a super-eruption, the theory practically wrote itself. Here's a civilization whose power is tied to ships, to maritime trade, to the sea. Here's one of the biggest volcanic events in human memory, exploding right in their backyard, smack in the middle of their shipping lanes. Here's a destruction horizon on Crete, a sudden break, fire, collapse, within a century or so of that eruption. It's not hard to see why the volcano did it became the leading explanation for the fall of Minoan civilization. The dirt seemed to cooperate. Across the Aegean you find the same distinctive fingerprint, a layer of white or pale grey volcanic tephra, ash and pumice, resting like a timestamp in the ground. In lake beds in Turkey and Greece, in seabed cores from the eastern Mediterranean, in buried fields and harbour sediments on islands hundreds of kilometres away. That Theran ash layer becomes a marker horizon, a geological bookmark that says here, this is the moment after the sky turned to stone. On Thera itself, you can walk down through the excavation trenches and watch history reverse. Modern fill, Hellenistic and Roman debris, darker, older soil, then suddenly a band of sterile, ashy material meters thick, made of pulverized rock and glass. Beneath that, the Bronze Age world of Akrotiri, frozen in time. On Crete and other islands, the ash is usually thinner, sometimes just a few centimetres, but it's still there. A sprinkling in farm fields that were later reworked. A smear in harbour basins, microscopic glass shards trapped in peat bogs and lake mud, identifiable under a microscope by their chemistry as coming specifically from Thera. Volcanologists and archaeologists use that layer the way tree ring experts use a year of drought or fire. It ties different sites together. If you can say this destruction happened just above the Thera ash, or this town was flourishing when the ash fell and ruined a few roofs, then rebuilt afterward, you start building a relative timeline across the whole region. And for decades, many scholars looked at that timeline and saw a straightforward story. Thera erupts. The sky darkens. Ships are lost. Ports are choked. Ash and tsunamis smash agriculture and coastal infrastructure. The Minoan economy, heavily dependent on trade and surplus production, collapses. Social order breaks down. Mycenaean elites from the Greek mainland move into the vacuum and seize Knossos. Volcano equals collapse. Elegant, dramatic, almost cinematic. But as more evidence piled up, the neatness of that picture began to fray. The ash didn't always line up cleanly with the destruction layers on Crete. Some places seemed to ride out the eruption better than others. The dates got messy. The Thera eruption is still central to the story. It's still written into the very sediments of the Aegean as one of the great natural catastrophes of the Bronze Age. Whether it was the executioner of Minoan civilization or just one more blow in a longer sequence of disasters depends on how you read that ash line in the dirt. And to read it properly, you have to go to the place that shows us the eruption's aftermath in almost unbearable detail, the buried town on the side of the volcano itself. Akrotiri doesn't look like much from the surface. You walk across a windswept patch of Santorini, past hotels and vineyards and souvenir shops, and then you step down a ramp into a cavern of concrete and steel. Underneath that shell is a dead city. When excavators first started digging here in the late 1960s under the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, they thought they were uncovering a small prehistoric village. A few walls, some pots, maybe a shrine. The deeper they went, the more wrong that assumption looked. Street after street emerged from beneath the ash. Multi-story buildings. Staircases still climbing into nowhere. Drains and sewers. Storage rooms packed with jars, workshops, town squares. This was not a village on the fringe of the Minoan world. This was a thriving Bronze Age port, plugged directly into that sea network we talked about earlier. And it was gone in an instant. What makes Akrotiri so disturbing is not just that it was destroyed, but how perfectly it was preserved. When Thera blew, waves of hot ash and pumice fell over the town, filling rooms, choking alleys, sealing doorways. Roofs collapsed under the weight. Entire buildings were entombed in a sterile, airtight cocoon of volcanic debris several meters thick. Organic materials that should have rotted away, wooden beds, baskets, even food left negative impressions in the ash. Plaster clung to walls, paint held its colour. It's the same basic process that would later preserve Pompeii and Herculaneum under Vesuvius. But 1,000 years earlier, open a room at Akrotiri, and you're looking straight into the late Bronze Age. Except there's something missing. At Pompeii, you find people, bodies contorted in their final moments, buried under roof tiles, huddled in doorways, encased in ash. Their casts have become almost too famous. In Akrotiri, after decades of excavation, you find almost no one. No mass graves in the streets. No skeletons pressed against jammed doors. No desperate last-minute attempt to flee across the plaza. Instead, you get an eerie sense of order. Storage jars were stacked and sealed. Valuable bronze tools seem to have been collected. Many rooms are strangely empty of personal items, as if cupboards and chests had already been cleared out. In some places, furniture impressions show that beds were dragged or tilted, then left. It looks less like a town caught off guard, and more like a town that had time to pack. that matches what volcanologists think happened in the run-up to the final blast. Before the caldera blew itself apart, Thera probably went through a long crisis phase, swarms of earthquakes, ground deformation, gas emissions, minor eruptions dusting the island with ash. If you live on a volcano and the earth starts shuddering under your feet for days, then weeks, then months, you don't wait for the mountain to make up its mind. You start moving your life somewhere else. Akrotiri gives us the archaeological trace of that decision. The people seem to have evacuated in stages, taking what they could carry, storing bulky goods for later retrieval, maybe even coming back between tremor episodes to salvage more. Then the window closed. At some point in that sequence, the final eruption began in earnest. Ashfall intensified. Roofs started collapsing. Pumice buried the streets. Whatever was still in town, amphorae too heavy to move, furniture, offerings on altars, painted walls, was locked away under a concrete hard shell of volcanic debris. So when we say Minoan Pompeii, it's only half right. Pompeii shows us a city dying in real time. Akrotiri shows us a city in the act of leaving, frozen an hour before the curtain comes down. And that frozen moment is a gold mine. Walk through those excavated blocks, and you see just how closely Akrotiri's culture was intertwined with Crete. The layout of houses with their central rooms, light wells and storage spaces echoes Minoan architecture. Pottery styles, decorative motifs, even the shape of drinking cups tie directly into what we find at Knossos and other Cretan sites. But Akrotiri isn't a carbon copy, it's a hybrid, a Cycladic town wearing Minoan fashion. The walls are covered in frescoes, and these are where the place really starts to talk. In one building you get the famous flotilla fresco, a panorama of ships strung between rocky headlands, dolphins leaping alongside hulls, people crowding the decks. It's not just pretty art, it's a map of how these people saw their world, a chain of ports bound together by water and wood. Elsewhere, boys box with gloved fists. Women in elaborate flounced skirts and bare-breasted bodices process through sanctuaries. Griffins and lilies, monkeys and antelopes parade along the plaster, rendered with a lightness and naturalism that feels startlingly modern. You see the same kind of religious atmosphere we saw in Minoan Crete. Shrines tucked into upper rooms, horns of consecration, ritual vessels. No giant statues of kings, no monumental throne rooms. If there were elites here, they signalled power in a different way, through painted walls, imported goods, maybe control of trade routes. The artifacts tell a similar story. Storerooms bulge with pithoi, those massive storage jars ready to hold wine, oil, grain. Workrooms are littered with loom weights, suggesting organised textile production. You find copper ingots, obsidian blades, imported pottery from Crete, the mainland, even further afield. Akrotiri was not a backwater, it was plugged into a network that stretched across the Aegean and into the eastern Mediterranean, sending and receiving goods, ideas, styles. And then the network node vanished. The lack of human remains at the site tempts you to a comforting thought. Maybe they all got away. Maybe the people of Akrotiri watched their town disappear under a column of ash from the safety of some distant island shore. It's possible. They clearly had time to move. The evacuation looks organised, not panicked. But we have to be careful. We're looking at one town on one flank of the volcano. Other settlements closer to vents or to the coastline may not have been so lucky. Pyroclastic flows and tsunamis are not gentle negotiators. What Akrotiri can say with unusual clarity is this. The eruption was not a silent bolt from the blue. It was preceded by enough warning that an entire urban community could react, abandon houses, secure goods, get most of its people off the island. That has big implications for how we think about Thera's impact on Crete. If a town sitting on the volcano itself can manage an orderly retreat, what about cities 100 kilometers away? Did Cretan harbours watch the signs and temporarily shut down? Did priests read the earthquakes as omens and stage rituals, or advise their rulers to move ships and stockpile grain? Akrotiri doesn't answer those questions, but it sharpens them. It gives us a snapshot of the Minoan-influenced Aegean world in the last calm before the storm. Trade humming, art flourishing, religion centred on nature and ceremony. People confident enough in their maritime skills to live on the slopes of a restless mountain. Then the ash falls, the roofs cave in, and the moment is sealed. To understand what happened next, who felt the blast when, and how we can even date that catastrophic day, we have to leave the buried streets of Akrotiri for an even trickier landscape. The argument's over when exactly Thera blew its top. Ask a room of Aegean archaeologists a simple question. So, when did Thera erupt? And watch the temperature spike 10 degrees. Because underneath almost every theory about the Minoan collapse lurks a quieter, more technical fight. Did the volcano blow when the traditional timeline says it did, or decades earlier? On one side, you've got what's often called the low chronology. This is the classic textbook version that anchored the eruption somewhere around 1500 to 1450 BC, usually tied directly or indirectly to the period when the great palaces on Crete show signs of destruction and reorganization. This timeline is built the old-fashioned way, layer by layer, pot by pot, inscription by inscription. Archaeologists dig a site, see which pottery styles sit in the same layers as Thera ash, then plug those styles into a bigger web of dates across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. At the centre of that web sits the most precise ancient calendar we've got, Egypt's. Egyptian scribes wrote down everything. Names of kings, lengths of reigns, festivals, deliveries of tribute, astronomical observations. Over decades, historians have taken those texts and built a pretty tight timeline of who ruled when. Now add in trade. We know Minoan-style pottery and Aegean goods made it to Egypt. We also know Egyptian scarabs, luxury items, and even raw materials like papyrus and ivory flowed back the other way. When you find an Egyptian object in a well-dated tomb sitting next to Aegean pottery of a particular style, you can say, okay, this kind of Aegean pot was in circulation during the reign of this pharaoh. Do that enough times, at enough sites, and a pattern forms. By that logic, the mature Neopalatial phase of Minoan Crete, the era of those big rebuilt palaces, and the flourishing network that Akrotiri belonged to, lines up best with the 16th and 15th centuries BC, the time of Egypt's powerful 18th dynasty. That's why, for a long time, most scholars were comfortable parking the Thera eruption somewhere in that window. If the eruption is linked to the destruction of those palaces, the mid-15th century BC feels about right. Then radiocarbon crashed the party. When scientists started taking samples from Thera and related sites, charred seeds, bits of wood, organic remains trapped in the ash, the dates they got back were awkward. Instead of clustering neatly around 1500 or 1450 BC, a lot of the radiocarbon results pointed earlier. Not centuries earlier, but enough to matter. Late 17th century BC. Somewhere in the 1620s to 1600s, depending on how you calibrate the data. From a lab perspective, this high chronology looked solid. Multiple independent samples from different sites and different materials, converging on a similar window. From an archaeological perspective, it was like someone had yanked the rug. Because if Thera erupted around 1625 BC, then it didn't blow up at the same time the Cretan palaces were burning in 1450. It happened a full human lifetime, or more, before that wave of destructions. Suddenly, the neat story where Volcano erupts, palaces fall started to fray. Radiocarbon isn't the only scientific line of attack. People have gone looking for Thera's fingerprint in places where nature keeps its own diary. High up in Greenland and Antarctica, ice cores preserve annual layers of snowfall going back tens of thousands of years. Some of those layers contain spikes in volcanic ash and sulfur. Around 1628 BC in certain cores, there's a pronounced signal, evidence of a very large eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere. It's tempting to say that's Thera. Tree rings seem to back something big happening around that time. In Europe, North America and parts of Asia, tree ring sequences show a period of reduced growth and cooler temperatures in the late 17th century BC. Trees don't write histories, but they do record stress. A massive eruption throwing dust and sulfur into the atmosphere would be a pretty good candidate for that kind of global wobble. Put those together, the radiocarbon dates, the ice, the tree rings, and the scientific case for an earlier eruption date looks pretty compelling. So why aren't all the archaeologists packing up and moving their timelines 50 to 100 years back? Because the rest of the puzzle doesn't slide that easily. If you push Thera into the 1620s, you have to stretch or reconfigure a whole chain of Aegean-Egyptian synchronisms. You'd be saying that certain styles of pottery, long tied to particular pharaohs' reigns, are actually older than we thought. You might have to rethink which Minoan goods belong in which phase of the Egyptian 18th dynasty. In some cases, you might be implying that two objects sitting together in a tomb were manufactured decades apart, and then randomly ended up side by side. For people who've spent their careers building a finely tuned relative chronology out of sherds and inscriptions, that's not a small adjustment. It's more like telling a watchmaker that every gear in their mechanism needs to be recut. And there are technical wrinkles on the science side too. Radiocarbon dates have to be calibrated because the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere has fluctuated over time. The calibration curve isn't perfectly smooth. In some periods it flattens out, creating plateaus where a single measured value can map to several calendar decades. The late 17th century BC sits annoyingly close to one of those tricky stretches, short-lived samples, like seeds from an olive tree buried in the Thera ash, give a sharper date than, say, a chunk of old timber that might already have been 100 years old when the volcano blew. But every sample still carries error bars. Stack those bars on top of each other, and the clean edges of 1627 BC or 1600 BC start to blur. Meanwhile, ice cores don't come with labels. That big volcanic spike around 1628 BC might be Thera or some other enormous eruption we haven't matched yet. There are known candidates elsewhere in the world. Matching the chemistry of tiny ash particles from the ice to the known chemistry of Thera's magma is possible, but so far the correlations are suggestive rather than absolutely decisive. So you get this standoff. On one side, stratigraphy, pottery sequences, Egyptian king lists, the slow, cumulative work of traditional archaeology pointing to a mid-16th or mid-15th century eruption if you want Thera close to the Minoan collapse. On the other, radiocarbon labs, ice cores, dendrochronologists with their long rolls of tree ring data, arguing that the volcano blew a generation or two earlier. Why does a gap of a few decades matter so much? Because cause and effect in ancient history is fragile. If Thera erupts around 1625 BC, then by the time Knossos and the other major Cretan centres are destroyed around 1450 BC, the immediate shockwaves, literal and economic, from the volcano are long gone. Thera might still have destabilised things, but more as a distant prelude, not a direct knockout punch. If, on the other hand, you keep Thera late, somewhere close to 1500 or 1450 BC, you can still plausibly imagine tsunamis battering Cretan harbours right before the palaces go up in flames, Ashfall's poisoning fields in the same generation that Linear B scribes start writing Greek in former Minoan palaces. Shift the date, and the narrative of what killed the Minoans changes character. Because of that, the debate hasn't gone away. It's evolved. Teams are still taking new samples, charred wood from shipwrecks, seeds from sealed storage jars, plant remains trapped under floors, to refine radiocarbon datasets. Ice core specialists are re-examining their layers with better instruments. Tree ring chronologies are being extended and tied together from different regions to see if those growth anomalies really sync up with an Aegean event. On the archaeological side, people are combing through storerooms and excavation notebooks, looking for overlooked synchronisms, an Egyptian object in a well-dated Aegean layer, a Cyprus connection that might serve as a bridge, any small clue that could tighten the screws on the timeline. The result is that we now live with two clocks ticking at once. One scientific, one archaeological, both precise in their own domains, both slightly out of phase. Until those clocks can be reconciled, every theory about Thera's role in the Minoan collapse has to carry an asterisk. If the eruption came early, it might have been a long, grinding stressor that weakened the system. If it came late, it might have been the final blow. To see how that plays out on the ground, how a single volcano could send walls of water across the Aegean and turn thriving ports into rubble, we need to follow the shockwave south, into the harbours and coastal plains of Crete, and into one of the most dramatic possibilities, the tsunami theory. Imagine you're standing on the northern coast of Crete in the middle of the Bronze Age. The sea is everything. It's the road your traders travel, the shield that keeps enemies at arm's length, the source of fish, shellfish and prestige. Every bay is busy warehouses, quays, small shipyards where carpenters are forever repairing hulls that have come back from Egypt or Cyprus or the Cyclades. Now move your eyes north toward the horizon. Sitting out there, like a dark tooth on the edge of the world, is Thera. When that island finally tore itself apart, it didn't just throw ash and pumice into the sky. It dumped an unimaginable volume of rock into the sea in a matter of minutes. When you displace that much water that fast, you get something else. Waves. Not the rolling surf-style waves you get from wind. These are long, fast, basin-spanning pulses, tsunamis. In the Aegean, those waves wouldn't have had to travel across half an ocean. Thera sits only a few hundred kilometres from Crete. Put a major collapse of the caldera into the water, and numerical models suggest walls of water racing south at jet plane speeds. By the time they hit the Cretan shelf, they start to rear up. 5 meters, 10. Some models for local bays suggest initial run-ups of 15 to 20 meters or more, along certain stretches of the north coast, especially where the shoreline funnels the energy into narrow inlets. That's not a splash. That's a moving piece of the sea bigger than a palace. This isn't just computer fantasy. Geologists have gone looking for the fingerprints. On the north coast of Crete, places like Polycastro, Malea, and the low-lying areas around the Gulf of Mirabello, researchers have dug into coastal sediments and found layers that don't belong. Beaches, especially in calm bays, tend to build up in neat, predictable ways. Fine sands, shells, maybe the odd storm layer. But in some spots you get something different. A chaotic mix of materials tossed together and dumped inland in a single pulse. Marine shells sitting way above the normal high tide line. Rounded beach pebbles thrown far inland on top of what used to be Bronze Age fields. Shards of Minoan pottery embedded in those disturbed layers, in positions that make more sense if a massive wave bulldozed them there. In a few cases, those odd deposits seem to sit right above destruction levels in coastal settlements. Buildings smashed, walls shoved off their foundations, pottery scattered and broken in patterns, that don't look like slow abandonment or fire alone. In harbours that had been peacefully used for generations, the ground layers suddenly show debris from deeper offshore, dragged up and dumped by something with enough force to rip the seafloor and throw it onto land. None of this proves beyond argument that a Thera-born tsunami hit these exact spots. But put the pieces together: eruption to the north, disturbed marine deposits to the south, radiocarbon dates that broadly overlap the relevant centuries, and a picture starts to form. Now imagine what that would mean for a people like the Minoans. Coastal cities and harbours weren't just nice add-ons. They were the nervous system of the whole civilization. Knossos, sitting inland, might have been the political and religious brain. But the lifeblood goods, people, information flowed through places like Amnisos, Palais-Castro, Chania, and the smaller anchorages that dotted every good bay along the north shore. Those harbours held fleets. Not a handful of fishing boats, but dozens or hundreds of cargo vessels. Everything from small coasters hugging the shore to bigger ships running deep-sea routes to Egypt and the Levant. A large tsunami doesn't politely rise, touch the coast, and retreat. It slams in, tears out, and often comes back in multiple waves. Ships in the harbour are thrown against quays or ripped from their moorings and dumped inland. Piers collapse. Storage buildings near the waterline are flooded, their contents smashed and scattered. Salt water and debris surge into wells and cisterns. People unlucky enough to be on the shore or in low-lying coastal districts are simply gone. Even if the inland palaces escape direct physical damage, the shock to their system would have been brutal. Lose a third half or more of your active fleet in a day, and your overseas trade collapses. Lose your trained sailors, pilots, and shipwrights, and you don't replace them overnight. Ports choked with rubble can't load or unload cargo. Saltwater intrusion ruins fields and orchards near the coast. Fishing gear is destroyed. Warehouses that held surplus grain, oil, or wine, your buffer against bad harvests, are wiped out. For a land-based agrarian state, a tsunami is a catastrophe. For a thalassocracy, a sea power whose wealth is built on maritime networks, it's an amputation. To get a sense of scale, it helps to look at modern analogues. When the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami hit Aceh in Indonesia, waves 10 to 30 meters high devastated coastal cities. Entire ports vanished. Fishing fleets were turned into splinters. Roads and bridges near the coast were gone. In places, the line between land and sea moved inland by hundreds of meters. In 2011, the Tohoku tsunami in Japan, again on the order of 10 meters in many places, higher in some, overwhelmed sea walls, wrecked infrastructure and crippled ports in a country with advanced engineering, heavy machinery, and national emergency response systems. Now strip away concrete, steel, and modern warning systems. Replace container ships with wooden hulls and stone quays. It doesn't take much imagination to see how a Minoan harbour town could be all but erased by a comparable event. A wave big enough to tear heavy fishing boats out of the water and toss them inland is also big enough to pull down mud brick warehouses, topple seafront shrines, and drown workers, who made up the core labour force for loading and unloading ships. And the damage doesn't end when the water recedes. A maritime economy isn't just about physical structures, it's about relationships. If your partners in Egypt or Cyprus are relying on regular shipments of oil, wine, textiles, and artisans, and suddenly your ports are gone and your ships lie broken on the hillsides, someone else steps into that gap. Maybe Mycenaean Greeks, maybe Levantine traders, maybe local islanders who were less affected by the waves. Your reputation for reliability evaporates at the very moment you're least able to repair it. Still, the tsunami theory isn't a slam dunk. The geological evidence on Crete is patchy and debated. Some so-called tsunami deposits could be the result of big storms, long-term coastal erosion, or later human disturbance. Not every coastline shows clear, undisturbed layers of tsunami debris that can be neatly tied to the 17th or 15th century BC. In some key harbours, the stratigraphy is complicated or poorly preserved, making it hard to draw a clean line between normal destruction, like fires or earthquakes, and wave damage. And then there's the timing problem that haunts everything about Thera. If the eruption belonged to an earlier high chronology, then the tsunamis it sent would have hit Crete decades before the final round of palace destructions. In that case, the waves might have delivered a heavy blow that the Minoans partially recovered from. Ports rebuilt, fleets reconstituted, trade routes renegotiated. A crippling shock, yes, but not necessarily an instant civilization killer. If you keep the eruption late, closer to the palatial collapse, the tsunami theory looks much more like a knockout punch. But then you're swimming against some of the radiocarbon and ice core data. So we're left with a powerful image, walls of water roaring into the heart of a sea-based society, shredding the very infrastructure that made the Minoans rich. A disaster big enough to matter, but slippery enough in the record that we can't quite pin down exactly how or when its waves intersected with the final act of Minoan history. And even if the sea's assault didn't end the story by itself, it may have set the stage for the next chapter of destruction, the one that fell not from the water, but from the sky. Ash, when Thera blew, it didn't just send walls of water racing across the Aegean. It turned the sky into a weapon. A major explosive eruption throws ash, pumice, and sulfur-rich gases tens of kilometers up, punching into the stratosphere where normal weather can't quickly scrub it out. From there the fallout spreads, first in a dense umbrella near the volcano, then as a thinning veil drifting with the winds. So what did that mean for Crete? In the most dramatic version of the story, it's simple. You're a farmer outside one of the palaces, maybe near Phaistos or Mallia. It's spring. The barley is greening nicely, olives are budding, the grapevines are waking up. Then the light changes. Fine ash begins to fall. At first it looks like grey snow, then thicker, heavier. It settles on leaves, clogs the spaces between grains, turns irrigation channels into sludge. If it keeps coming for hours, you end up with centimetres of powder blanketing the fields. Too much, too fast, and the crops suffocate. Photosynthesis shuts down. Delicate flowers that would have become fruit are smothered or burned by acidic particles. You might survive the tsunami only to watch your next harvest die where it stands. This is the nightmare scenario. Ashfall heavy enough on Crete to trigger immediate crop failure. No grain, no fodder, no surplus. The storage jars in the palaces go from security blanket to last line of defence. One bad year you can ride out. 2 or 3 in a row, stripped of your overseas trade and coastal infrastructure, and you're staring at famine. But did it actually happen like that? When archaeologists go hunting for the ash, the picture gets murkier. Near Thera itself and in parts of the Cyclades, the eruption layer is unmistakable. Thick bands of white-grey pumice and ash, sometimes tens of centimetres deep, sitting like a timestamp in the soil. Farther away, that blanket thins out. On Crete, we don't find anything like the catastrophic layers seen closer to the source. What turns up instead are patchy, often very thin deposits, millimetres to maybe a few centimetres identified as Theran ash in cores, lake sediments or soil profiles. In some places you get a clear spike. In others it's barely there or missing altogether, either because the ash never fell thickly or later erosion and farming erased the record. That has led to a long-running argument. One camp says, thin ash, modest impact. A dusting of volcanic material over Crete might have been annoying, irritating to lungs, abrasive to eyes, temporarily dirtying cisterns and open water, but not a civilization killer. Plants can tolerate small amounts of ash. In some cases, volcanic deposits even act as fertilizer once they weather and release nutrients. In this view, the agricultural base of Crete takes a hit, but doesn't collapse. The other camp says, don't be fooled by thickness alone. Even a few millimeters of fine, glassy ash can do serious damage if it falls during the wrong phase of the growing season. Barley and wheat at flowering are extremely sensitive. A thin coating on leaves and ears can stunt or kill the crop. Ash washed into irrigation systems can clog channels and wells. Livestock grazing on ash-coated plants may get sick. And what we see in surviving cores might be a poor reflection of how variable the fallout was at the time. Local storms, wind shifts and topography could produce pockets of much heavier deposition that simply haven't been sampled yet, or were later ploughed away by 3,500 years of farmers. And that's just the local story. Above the regional ash cloud, the eruption injected sulfur dioxide high into the atmosphere, where it reacts to form tiny sulfate aerosols. Those particles reflect sunlight back into space. On a global scale, this kind of veil can dim the sun just enough to cool average temperatures for a year or two. We know this from modern events. The 1991 Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines cooled global temperatures by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for a couple of years. Go back to the 1815 Tambora eruption, and you get the year without a summer in 1816, failed harvests, freak frosts, and food shortages across parts of Europe and North America. Was Thera in that league? Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica do show volcanic sulfate spikes around the general window for the Santorini eruption, but tying any specific layer unambiguously to Thera has proven hard. The dating isn't precise enough for everyone to agree, and there may have been multiple big eruptions in a relatively short span. So volcanic winter in the strict, global sense is debated. Some researchers argue that Thera's sulfur output, while big, wasn't enormous compared to true climate giants like Tambora. Others counter that even a moderate regional cooling in the eastern Mediterranean, slightly shorter growing seasons, a run of cooler, wetter or more erratic years could have been enough to hammer Bronze Age agriculture that was already stretched. Imagine that combination. You've lost key ports and ships to the tsunami. Your trading partners are shaky or turning elsewhere. Now, over the next decade, you suffer through a string of poor harvests. Maybe not absolute crop failure everywhere, every year, but enough local disasters that surplus shrinks, granaries empty faster, and the margin for error disappears. In a palatial system like the Minoans ran, that margin was everything. The elite at Knossos and the other centres weren't just hoarding grain to show off. They were managing risk, smoothing out the bumps between good years and bad, feeding specialised craftsmen, sailors and administrators who didn't farm full-time. Take away reliable surpluses, and suddenly the whole redistributive machine starts grinding and clanking. Officials can't fulfill rations promised to workers. Dependent communities get restless. Local elites hoard or cheat the system. People on the margins, herders in the uplands, villagers in more marginal zones, start to feel that the palace isn't protecting them anymore. And if the bad years stack up, you get more than hunger. You get migration, banditry, local revolts, and a slow erosion of confidence in the institutions at the top. This is the quieter face of catastrophe. Not a single apocalyptic night where everything burns, but a decade or two in which fields underperform. The climate feels off. The sky has seasons of strange haziness, and rumours spread that the gods have turned away. A volcanic event like Thera could plausibly have lit that fuse. Whether the ash on Crete was thick enough to bury fields, or thin enough to barely be noticed in the soil record, most scholars agree on one thing. If Thera hurt Minoan agriculture, it did so as part of a chain reaction. It weakened the base. It made every other problem, tsunamis, earthquakes, political rivalries, foreign competition, more dangerous. And in the generations after the eruption, as the earth under Crete kept trembling, and new powers rose on the mainland, that weakened base would become harder and harder to defend. For decades, the Thera eruption was the smoking gun. If you opened a book on the Bronze Age Aegean in the mid-20th century, the story was almost comforting in its simplicity. Enormous volcano explodes, tsunami hits Crete, ash poisons the fields, Minoan civilization collapses. Neat cause, neat effect. But when you start lining up the dates and the archaeology, that tidy narrative starts to fray. First problem, time. The eruption of Thera didn't happen on the same day. The Minoan palaces burned. The more closely we look, the more we see a gap. In some regions, it looks like decades, maybe even a century or more, depending on which chronology you favour. At sites on Crete, destruction layers that clearly belong to the final collapse of the palatial system often sit above, not within, the levels that show tsunami damage or ash traces. You get rebuilding episodes, fresh floors, new pottery styles, even modifications to palaces after the eruption horizon. In other words, whatever hit them, it wasn't a clean overnight kill shot from Thera. Knossos is the most awkward piece in this puzzle. If the volcano was supposed to have decapitated Minoan power, someone forgot to tell Knossos. The main palace there not only survives the eruption phase, it appears to flourish afterwards. Some of the richest late Minoan material frescoes, luxury goods, elaborate storage systems belongs to this post-Thera period. You see new building phases, continued long-distance trade, busy workshops. This is not a city limping along on life support. It looks like a centre that either managed to dodge the worst or exploit the chaos to tighten its grip on the rest of the island. That alone should give us pause. If the volcano killed the Minoan story were literally true, you'd expect the big palatial hub to be devastated or abandoned right after the eruption. Instead, Knossos becomes more dominant in the generations that follow, not less. Then there's the ash. Earlier we imagined those nightmare fields under a suffocating grey blanket. But when geologists and soil scientists actually sample Crete, what they usually find is underwhelming. In core after core, the Theran ash signal is thin. Millimetres, sometimes a centimetre or two. Patchy, discontinuous, sometimes absent altogether. Enough to prove that the cloud reached the island, yes. But probably not enough on its own to guarantee island-wide agricultural collapse. Some recent studies have gone further, modelling how ash loads of those thicknesses would affect typical Mediterranean crops. The verdict is mixed under certain unlucky timing, say ash falling right at flowering. You might get serious local damage, but a blanket famine across all of Crete. That's hard to sustain if the fallout was as light and variable as the sediments suggest. You can push back and argue that we haven't sampled every valley, that erosion may have stripped the thickest deposits. And that's a fair point, but the more data we accumulate, the harder it becomes to claim a uniform civilization ending ashfall on Crete itself. The tsunami has similar issues once you move inland. There's compelling evidence that huge waves slammed into parts of the north coast. At places like Amnisos and Palekastro, you find jumbled debris, marine sediments and architecture that looks violently rearranged, all consistent with a major inundation. But Crete isn't a flat sandbar. It's a big mountainous island with high plateaus and interior plains. Yet we also see later destruction in sites well away from obvious tsunami reach. burned palaces, toppled buildings, massacres and abandonments in inland locations that a wave simply couldn't have touched. You can say reasonably that knocking out ports and fleets would cripple the economy, and those shockwaves would eventually be felt everywhere. But that's an indirect long fuse, not a direct physical levelling of the whole society in a single event. The tsunami could devastate coasts. It doesn't fully explain fires in upland towns a generation or two later. Put these strands together, the timeline gap, the thriving post-eruption Knossos, the modest ash on most of Crete, the inland destruction, and a pattern emerges. It's not that the volcano didn't matter. It clearly did. But it doesn't line up well as the one-size-fits-all final blow. That's exactly where many archaeologists have landed in the last few decades. Instead of treating Thera as the sole cause, they increasingly see it as a stress multiplier. A huge traumatic event that smashed fleets, shook trade networks, maybe ruined some harvests, and certainly terrified everyone who saw the sky darken and the sea rise, but one disaster among several, not the entire story by itself. Older scholarship liked single-bullet explanations. One earthquake, one invasion, one eruption, and the curtain falls. Newer work on collapses from the Bronze Age to the Maya to early states in China keeps finding the same thing. Complex systems rarely die of just one thing. They get chipped away by a sequence of hits, often over multiple generations. The Minoan case has followed that larger shift. The volcano has been downgraded from executioner to accomplice. It weakened a system that, as we've seen, depended on delicate balances of trade, surplus and centralized control. Then other forces, tectonic, political, military, had more room to do damage. So if Thera didn't single-handedly wipe the Minoans off the map, what finished the job? To answer that, we have to look down, not up, to the island's own faults, literally and figuratively. The ground under Crete never stopped moving, and the palace system itself may have been more fragile than it looked. Crete sits on a geological fault line in more ways than one. Pull up a modern seismic map of the eastern Mediterranean, and the island glows like a hotspot. It's perched at the collision zone where the African tectonic plate dives under the Eurasian plate. That subduction boundary is still grinding today, producing regular earthquakes, some of them big enough to topple modern buildings. The Minoans lived on that moving platform for centuries. We tend to imagine the Thera eruption as the big, cinematic moment, but for people on Crete, the earth shaking was a recurring feature of life. Not a rare cosmic punishment, but a low, constant drumbeat in the background. Archaeology backs this up, long before the final palatial destruction. You can trace a pattern of collapse and repair baked into the buildings themselves. At major sites like Knossos, Phaistos and Malea, you don't just get a neat sequence of old palace, then new palace, then destruction. You get walls that have been rebuilt, buttressed, thickened. Staircases re-engineered, columns replaced or reset. Masonry patched with different styles of stonework. In some levels you find floors buckled but not burned, walls that have shifted sideways and then been straightened, fallen blocks carefully reused in later phases. These are classic signs of earthquake damage, not warfare or fire. And crucially, some of these destruction layers predate the Theran eruption. Others have nothing to do with ash or tsunami sediments at all. They're separate episodes, their own disasters. That suggests a very different story from everything was fine until the volcano blew. Imagine growing up in a society where your palace has already collapsed once in your grandparents' lifetime, where you can walk past the older buried foundations and see how the previous version of your world literally fell down, where every generation has its own story of the big one. Now add the architectural stakes. Minoan palaces weren't light little huts. They were massive, multi-story complexes with labyrinths of rooms, heavy stone walls, timber reinforcements, and sometimes flat, load-bearing roofs. They stored huge quantities of grain, oil, and wine in pithoi, those enormous storage jars packed into magazines like industrial warehouses. When the ground lurches under that much weight, structural weakness isn't just a matter of a few cracked walls. Entire wings can fail, stairs shear off, upper floors pancake onto lower ones. Roof beams snap, crushing people, goods, and precious ritual spaces underneath. Every time that happened, the elites running those palaces had to make choices. Do you rebuild on the same spot, patching the damage, or do you shift operations elsewhere? Do you pour labour and resources into reinforcing walls, adding timber frames, redesigning columns? Do you write off some damaged storerooms and hope the rest holds? For the Minoans, the answer, again and again, seems to have been rebuild. We see later floors laid over earlier rubble, new architectural phases rising on top of compacted debris. In some cases, the new palace is even grander, more complex, more heavily decorated than the one that fell. That tells us something powerful about their resilience, but also about the pressure building inside the system. Because rebuilding isn't free. Every reconstruction wave would have sucked in huge amounts of labour, farmers pulled from fields, craftspeople diverted from making trade goods, administrators rewriting storage records, priests reconsecrating damaged shrines. Surplus that might have gone into trade expeditions, diplomatic gifts, or local infrastructure instead gets eaten by emergency repairs. Do that once, and you can probably absorb the hit. Do it twice in a century, and now generational wealth is locked up in shoring up old structures instead of expanding new ones. Do it 3 or 4 times over 200 years, and you can imagine the strain. Maybe that strain doesn't show up immediately as revolt. It shows up as grumbling, as local elites on the fringes deciding that the central palace isn't pulling its weight, as villages quietly keeping a bit more of their harvest instead of sending it to the storerooms, as merchants looking for alternative partners when palace warehouses can't guarantee regular supplies. This is where some scholars start talking not just about earthquakes, but about cumulative structural fatigue, both in stone and in society. Physically, repeated tremors weaken foundations, even if they don't cause spectacular collapses every time. Cracks propagate, timber joints loosen, walls settle unevenly. The palace you see in its final phase might look impressive, but parts of it are patched, compromised, vulnerable. When a really big quake finally hits, it doesn't have to do all the work from scratch. It just has to push a system that's already leaning. Socially and economically, the same logic applies. Each earthquake doesn't just knock down walls, it knocks confidence. Trade partners who once saw Minoan ports as rock solid might start hedging, diversifying their routes to Cyprus, the Levant, or rising Mycenaean centres on the mainland. Farmers whose granaries collapsed once too often might invest in their own small storage rather than relying on palace redistribution. Religious authority can wobble when the sacred heart of your world, the central sanctuary complex, keeps getting smashed by forces your priests can't control. Add another ingredient, politics. We don't have Minoan chronicles telling us of coups and civil wars, but it would be strange if a complex hierarchical society like this never had internal conflict. Earthquakes create perfect opportunities and excuses for power struggles. If one palace suffers especially badly in a quake, while another escapes with minor damage, the lucky centre can suddenly find itself in a position to dominate its weakened rival. Leaders can be blamed for angering the gods, for failing to protect the land, for mishandling relief and reconstruction. Ambitious factions can redirect rebuilding funds toward their own clients and loyalists. Behind the clean archaeological labels Late Minoan ire, LMIB, there may have been decades of simmering tensions, regional rivalries, tax disputes, friction between old families and up-and-coming elites whose wealth came from trade rather than land. In that light, earthquakes are less the cause and more the trigger for each new round of stress. This is the essence of what's sometimes called system collapse theory. You don't need a single apocalyptic event. You need an interconnected system that has grown so tightly wired, economically, politically, ideologically, that multiple smaller shocks start to interact. A bad harvest is survivable. A bad harvest plus earthquake damage, plus a temporary dip in trade, plus a succession crisis at the palace. That's where things start to spiral, in a system like the Minoan palatial network, where surplus from many communities flowed into central nodes and then radiated outward again. Every node depended on every other. Knock one out with a quake, and you don't just lose a building. You lose storage capacity, redistribution routes, ritual legitimacy, administrative oversight. The load shifts to the remaining centres. They stretch to cover the gap. Then the next tremor comes. Layer Thera's disruptions, tsunami damage to ports, short-term climate impacts, on top of a landscape already scarred by centuries of seismic wear and tear. And you can see why some archaeologists picture the final collapse not as a single blow, but as the last domino in a long chain. And once those dominoes started falling, someone was waiting just across the sea, watching the cracks widen in the Cretan world and deciding how to move in. That's where the Mycenaeans enter the story, not necessarily as destroyers out of nowhere, but as opportunists stepping into a system already shaken to its core. By the mid-15th century BC, there was nothing up and coming about the people across the water anymore. On the Greek mainland, a different kind of Bronze Age power had been hardening for generations, the Mycenaeans. If the Minoans were the cosmopolitan sea lords of the eastern Mediterranean, the Mycenaeans were their land-based, war-gear-loving cousins, fortified hilltop citadels at places like Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, massive cyclopean walls, shaft graves and tholos tombs packed with weapons, gold masks, boar's tusk helmets, chariots. Their art is full of warriors, hunting scenes, chariot combat. Even their pottery feels more angular, more rigid, compared to the flowing, almost playful curves of classic Minoan designs. They knew the Minoans well. They copied Minoan fashions, imported Minoan goods, learned from Minoan scribes. Their elites clearly saw Cretan culture as something worth imitating, and eventually something worth taking over. Because when you look at the archaeological sequence on Crete, after that great wave of destructions around 1450 BC, something unmistakable appears in the rubble. Mycenaean fingerprints. At Knossos, the largest and most resilient of the Cretan palaces, the story doesn't end with the burn layer. It changes accent above the destruction debris. You get a new phase of occupation. Same basic palace footprint, same labyrinthine core, but now the material culture starts to tilt. Pottery styles shift toward mainland forms. Burial practices in the surrounding area begin to look less Minoan and more in line with what you see in Mycenaean Greece. Weapons, swords, spearheads, armour fittings turn up in ways and quantities that don't match earlier Cretan patterns, and crucially when writing returns to the palace, it's no longer indecipherable Linear A. It's Linear B, an adapted version of the script used to write an early form of Greek. Something changed in who was running the show. One straightforward explanation is the cinematic one. The Mycenaeans saw a rival system staggering under the combined blows of earthquakes, tsunamis and internal stress, and they moved in with swords drawn. In this model, Cretan palaces, shocked and weakened, were taken by force. Mainland warbands, already familiar with the island through trade and diplomacy, now arrived as conquerors. They garrisoned key centres, installed their own elites in the heart of Knossos, and slotted Crete into a wider Mycenaean political orbit. There are things that seem to fit this picture. You get more weapons in burial contexts, warrior graves, mainland-style tombs. The iconography of power tilts away from purely Minoan religious imagery and toward the martial. Administrative practices visible in Linear B tablets at Knossos look strikingly like what we see later in clearly Mycenaean centres on the mainland. Greek names, Greek gods, Greek-style bureaucratic categories layered onto a Cretan landscape. Some scholars see this as the archaeological shadow of a coup, a foreign elite taking over an existing palace complex, using its storage, its scribes, its religious prestige, but now in service of Mycenaean interests. But when you zoom in, the picture gets murkier. Those post-destruction levels at Knossos don't scream burned to the ground and rebuilt from scratch by barbarians. There's continuity. Local craftspeople keep producing Minoan-style goods alongside mainland forms. Many aspects of religious practice persist. Some shrines continue in use with only subtle changes in ritual equipment. Architecture evolves, but it's not a total break. That's led to an alternative way of looking at the takeover, not as a clean, bloody invasion, but as a more complicated process of assimilation, intermarriage, and political realignment. In this view, Mycenaean influence on Crete didn't start at the moment of collapse. It had been building for generations. Mainland princes were already sending gifts, marrying into Cretan elites, hiring Minoan artisans and ship captains. Their pottery was already circulating in Cretan ports. Their prestige goods already showing up in local burials. When the palatial system on Crete took its major hit, whether from earthquakes, Thera's aftershocks, internal conflict, or all of the above, those pre-existing links suddenly mattered a lot more. Imagine a network of local Cretan elites, battered by disaster, watching their storage fail and their trade connections wobble. Across the water are allies and rivals with fresh manpower, intact fortresses, and deep pockets of gold. You can resist and risk isolation, or you can lean in. Under this model, Mycenaean conquest looks less like a single war and more like a creeping change in who holds the top jobs. Mainland nobles marry into Cretan families and claim inheritance rights. Mycenaean military specialists arrive as protectors or allies and gradually become the default power brokers. Local scribes are retrained to use Linear B to serve Greek-speaking lords. Minoan religious frameworks survive, but the names of the gods on the tablets slowly morph. The palace still stands, the rituals still happen, but when decisions are made about grain, bronze, and who gets to build a Tholos tomb, Greek voices are now in the room. The physical evidence lines up with a shift in ruling elite rather than a wholesale ethnic replacement. Weapon types at Knossos and other sites start to mirror Mycenaean forms. Burial customs change at the top more than at the bottom. Elite tombs adopt mainland styles and grave goods, while many ordinary Cretans seem to keep doing what their parents did. Administrative records show Greek names for officials and landholders, but the actual economic system, the way sheep, oil and grain move through the palace, feels like an evolution of earlier Minoan practice, not something entirely imported. This is why some archaeologists prefer to call the Mycenaeans opportunists, rather than straightforward invaders. They didn't necessarily have to smash the system, they just had to step into the cracks at the right moment. From that perspective, the Mycenaean takeover of Crete is part of a broader pattern we see over and over in history. A neighbouring power watching a sophisticated but stressed society stagger, then carefully inserting itself, first as partner, then as patron, finally as master. Trade relations become diplomatic ties become dependency. Dependency becomes control, but even if the swords stayed mostly sheathed, the outcome was dramatic. By the later 15th and early 14th centuries BC, the cultural centre of gravity on Crete had clearly shifted. The island that had once exported its styles, scripts, and symbolism to the mainland was now absorbing mainland ways in return. A place that had seemed, for centuries, like the beating heart of an independent Minoan world was being folded into a new Mycenaean-led network that stretched across the Aegean. And carved into the clay tablets of that new order is some of the best evidence we have for what actually changed at Knossos, and who exactly was giving the orders in the final phase of palace life. To get at that, we have to listen in on the people who were actually running Knossos in its final act. And that means talking about one of the great intellectual detective stories of the 20th century. When Arthur Evans first dug at Knossos, he found thousands of clay tablets covered in two different scripts. He called the older one Linear A and the later one Linear B. Both were clearly syllabic writing systems. Both recorded the same kinds of things: lists, accounts, inventories. Evans was convinced both were some form of the same underlying Minoan language. He was half right. Linear A is still stubbornly undeciphered. But Linear B, that one finally yielded. The breakthrough came not from an archaeologist, but from an English architect and self-taught linguistics obsessive named Michael Ventris, working in the 1950s with classicist John Chadwick and building on pattern analysis done earlier by Alice Kober. Ventris treated the tablets like a math problem. He charted sign frequencies. He tracked which symbols tended to show up together. He mapped how certain groups of signs changed when they appeared in different grammatical positions. Evans had assumed the language behind Linear B couldn't possibly be Greek. It was too early, too far from the Homeric world everybody knew. But when Ventris started plugging in possible sound values and testing them against place names we already recognized, Knossos, Amnisos, Pylos, something clicked. Suddenly streams of signs he'd been labelling with abstract numbers started to read as plausible Greek words. Not the smooth, poetic Greek of later literature, but a much older, more rugged cousin. Ka Sirayou for Basilius, Potinija for Potnia, lady, and Naka for Wanax, lord. The grammar fit. The recurring endings looked like Greek inflections. The personal names had familiar Greek roots. In 1952, Ventris went public, Linear B. The script used at Knossos, in its final palatial phase, was writing an early form of Greek. That single fact reshapes how we read the end of Minoan Crete. Because when you look at the Linear B tablets from Knossos, you're not hearing a ghostly Minoan tongue struggling to survive under new rulers. You're hearing the new rulers themselves, Greek-speaking administrators running a Cretan palace. What do they talk about? Not myths, not laws, not narratives. They talk about stuff. Sheep, mostly, and goats, and pigs, and cattle, and fields, vineyards, jars of oil, bronze ingots, chariot parts, armour, textiles. People too, but as entries in an account book. The tablets are snapshots of a highly organised palace economy, frozen in the moment before fire baked them hard. They show districts divided up and labelled, officials with Greek names overseeing flocks in specific regions, work groups of women, often designated as servants of the god, producing specific quantities of cloth or finished textiles, lists of bronze allocated to smiths for weapon production, inventories of chariot wheels, horse gear, and armour stored in palace magazines. It's bureaucracy as X-ray. You see the bones of the system that had grown up in the ruins of the earlier Minoan order. And while the basic idea, a central palace coordinating production, storing surplus, and redistributing goods, is very much in line with what we think the old Minoan palaces did, the way it's described feels different. For one thing, the terminology is Mycenaean. The top title on the tablets is the Wanax, the paramount lord, a term we know from the later mainland palaces at Pylos and Mycenae. Under him are other officials with clearly Greek titles and names. The gods receiving offerings include deities we recognize from later Greek religion: Poseidon, Zeus, in a somewhat embryonic form, a goddess that looks a lot like an early Athena. Old Cretan cults and symbols may still have been present in the shrines, but on paper, the divine hierarchy is being translated into Greek. For another, the whole administrative grammar, the way accounts are structured, is very close to what we see in definitively Mycenaean centres. The same categories for landholding, the same formulae for rations and allocations, the same obsession with standardizing units of wool, oil, and metal. When you line up tablets from Knossos with tablets from Pylos, they look like they were written by people trained in the same bureaucratic tradition. Same script, same language, same mindset. That's where we can start to see the political picture come into focus. A language shift like this, Linear A to Linear B, unknown Minoan language to early Greek, isn't something that happens because a few foreign merchants rented offices in the palace. Scripts are conservative, bureaucracies are conservative. They don't throw out centuries of habit because of fashion. To get a new language at the top, you almost certainly need a new elite at the top. The tablets don't tell us what language the farmers in the countryside spoke at home, or what prayers old priestesses murmured in mountain shrines. For all we know, Minoan could have lingered on for generations in everyday speech. But in the palace archives, the beating heart of power, Greek is the language of record. Greek names own the land, command the labour, dedicate the offerings. The way the tablets slice up the island reinforces that impression. You can see officials with Greek names controlling territories that had once been independent centres. Place names across Crete show up as administrative units under Gnossian oversight, suggesting that by the time these tablets were written, someone at Knossos was exerting a kind of island-wide authority. That pattern looks less like fragmented Minoan polities, and more like a Mycenaean-style kingdom superimposed on a Cretan landscape. You also get hints of how tightly integrated Crete had become into wider Mycenaean trade. The tablets record oil perfumed with exotic aromatics, textiles in standardized grades and colours, bronze flowing in and weapons flowing out. We know from other sites that Mycenaean palaces were plugged into long-distance networks moving copper from Cyprus, tin from farther east, luxury goods from Egypt and the Levant. Knossos, under its Greek-speaking rulers, seems to be playing in that same league, using the same accounting logic. And then there's taxation, or at least its Bronze Age cousin. Many tablets at Knossos list local communities or individuals delivering specific quotas of goods, especially wool, livestock, and finished textiles, to the palace. The pattern looks like a system where villages owe set contributions, measured and checked by scribes. Not a free market, a controlled flow, mediated by officials of the Wanax. All of this, language, titles, structure, reach, doesn't prove a Mycenaean invasion with spears and burning torches, but it does sit very comfortably with the idea that by the later 15th and early 14th centuries BC, Greek-speaking Mycenaean elites were running the palace system on Crete in their own image. Linear B is, in other words, the paper trail of a takeover. Not a smoking gun that tells us exactly how the Minoan collapse began, but a clear record of how power looked once the dust had started to settle. A Cretan landscape, Minoan infrastructure, and on top of it a Mycenaean-style governing class, counting sheep, collecting textiles, and offering to Greek-named gods. So, if the tablets show us who was in charge after the catastrophe, what brought that catastrophe on in the first place? To answer that, we have to stop looking for a single villain and start thinking like a disaster historian. because the evidence pointing to the end of the Minoan world looks less like one clean strike and more like a perfect storm. If you line up all the main explanations people have thrown at the Minoan collapse, they read like a menu of Bronze Age nightmares. A colossal volcanic eruption at Thera, throwing ash into the sky and tsunamis across the sea. A cascade of earthquakes rattling the palaces into rubble. Fires, famines and social unrest. And then, walking through the smoke, hard-driving Mycenaean warlords from the Greek mainland, seizing the weakened island for themselves. For a long time, scholars tended to pick a favourite and defend it like a football team. Was it the volcano? Was it the earthquakes? Was it climate? Was it invasion? More and more, the answer you hear now is yes. Not yes to every detail of every theory, but yes to the basic idea that there was no single bullet. What happened on Crete around the 15th century BC looks less like a one-off catastrophe and more like a civilization being hit again and again until something finally gave. Think about what we've already seen. Thera erupts in one of the largest volcanic events of the last several thousand years. Akrotiri on Santorini gets buried. The sea between there and Crete turns into a killing field of pumice and debris. Multiple tsunamis slam into the north coast of Crete, exactly where the richest Minoan harbours and coastal settlements are. Even if the waves never clawed their way all the way up to Knossos, they didn't have to. Smash enough ports, drown enough ships, ruin enough coastal farmland, and you punch a huge hole in a maritime economy that lives on trade and redistribution. On top of that, you have ashfall and atmospheric effects. The dating is messy, and it's still debated how much ash actually reached Crete, but you don't need a solid black rain of pumice over the island to do damage. A regional volcanic winter, odd weather for a few years, disrupted growing seasons in the places Minoans bought their grain from. That's enough to throw carefully balanced surplus calculations into chaos. Then, layer in earthquakes. We know Crete sits in one of the most seismically active zones in the Mediterranean. We know the palaces show multiple phases of rebuilding after quake damage. We know that around the time Thera blew, there's a horizon of destruction at many sites that looks suspiciously like seismic collapse and fire. Now imagine you're running a palace at Phaistos or Malea or Cato Zakros. You've just had your fleets crippled by tsunamis and your overseas suppliers scrambling after a regional shock. Before you can fully reorganize, the ground itself starts shaking. Storerooms fall, workshops burn, administrative buildings crack. You can rebuild once, maybe twice. But each time you do, you're dipping into reserves that are already strained. You're asking labour from people whose own houses and fields need fixing. You're trying to keep the old system humming while the physical infrastructure it runs on keeps breaking. That's where the idea of resilience thresholds comes in. Every complex society has some capacity to absorb shocks, bad harvests, raids, storms, even moderate earthquakes. As long as disruptions stay under a certain threshold, the system bends, creaks, and then snaps back. Surpluses smooth out the rough years. Networks reroute. People patch walls, rebuild docks, fill the state granaries again. But resilience isn't infinite. You can think of it like a series of blows to the same spot. The first one bruises, the second one cracks, the third one breaks. For Minoan Crete, a plausible multi-stage timeline looks something like this. First, decades before the final collapse, the Thera eruption goes off. It inflicts heavy regional damage on Minoan trade, religious centres and coastal infrastructure. The psychological impact is probably huge. Important sanctuaries on Thera are gone. Sea routes are dangerous. The Minoan thalassocracy, if it ever existed as a real political hegemony, takes a direct hit. The palaces on Crete survive, but they're rattled, economically, maybe even ideologically. A civilization whose identity is tied up with seafaring island sanctuaries and control of the Aegean suddenly finds itself staring at a flooded, pumice-choked horizon. Then, in the following decades, you get a sequence of strong earthquakes. We can see this archaeologically, major palaces suffering near simultaneous destruction around the so-called late Minoan horizon. Some are rebuilt in reduced form, others never really recover. Local elites lose their power bases, administrative centres that knit the island together crack apart. Amid all this, internal tensions rise. When redistributive systems fail, when promised grain doesn't show up, when damaged canals can't be repaired, when elite tombs and temples stop getting their offerings, people don't just shrug and accept it. They resist, they migrate, they fight. At some point in this long crisis, Mycenaean elites from the mainland move from being trade partners and occasional raiders to being political actors on Crete itself. Maybe they're invited in by a faction at Knossos, looking for military backing. Maybe they exploit a power vacuum after other palaces fall. Maybe they conquer outright in some regions and insinuate themselves more subtly in others. However it happens, by the time the dust settles, you have Greek-speaking administrators using Linear B at Knossos and the unmistakable imprint of Mycenaean political culture laid over a landscape that still bears Minoan architectural and religious scars. From this angle, the question stops being, was it the volcano, or the earthquakes, or the invaders, and becomes, how many hits can a palace system take before it can't function anymore, and who's standing nearby ready to benefit when it finally collapses? This isn't just a Minoan story. When historians look at other Bronze Age collapses, the fall of Hittite power in Anatolia, the burning of Mycenaean palaces on the mainland, the wider upheaval around 1200 BC, the same pattern appears. Climate stress, earthquakes, famine, internal rebellion, and outside pressure all pile up. Rarely is there one clean cause. More often there's a convergence, a perfect storm of overlapping crises driving a complex system past its breaking point. On Crete, the evidence points in that direction. A proud maritime civilization battered by environmental shocks, shaken by tectonic violence, strained by its own internal contradictions, and finally reshaped by ambitious neighbours. Not a sudden, clean, overnight obliteration, but a long, messy unravelling that later storytellers would compress into myths of monsters, kings, and labyrinths. To see how Minoan Crete fits into that wider pattern of Bronze Age chaos, we have to step back even further, out across the whole eastern Mediterranean, and watch how other great powers stumbled, burned, and vanished in the same age of disaster. When people talk about the late Bronze Age collapse, they're usually thinking of that dramatic crisis around 1200 BC. In just a few decades, palace societies that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries either vanish or shrink into shadows of their former selves. On the Greek mainland, Mycenaean palaces burn, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the age, disappears from history so completely that later Greeks barely remember it existed. In the Levant, rich cities like Ugarit are destroyed and never rebuilt. Egypt survives, barely, but spends the next centuries as a weakened, inward-looking power. Letters from this period sound like dispatches from a world falling apart. A Hittite king writing to Ugarit, "We're desperate for grain. Send ships." A ruler in the Levant warning that enemy fleets are ravaging the coast. Egyptian inscriptions boasting that they have beaten back mysterious sea peoples while quietly acknowledging that their own lands are suffering from famine and unrest. It's a civilization-scale crisis, and it doesn't stay neatly inside one kingdom's borders, which is exactly why historians keep coming back to the Minoans when they talk about it. Because what happened on Crete in the 15th century looks eerily like a first draft of the same story that will engulf everyone else 300 years later. Think of the big players. The Mycenaean palaces that take over Crete don't last forever. Around 1200 BC, they're hit by a wave of destruction that leaves their elite architecture burned, their bureaucracies gone, their writing system Linear B vanished. The Hittites, who command a huge territorial empire in Anatolia and northern Syria, simply drop out of the written record. Their capital, Hattusa, is abandoned. Smaller states on the Levantine coast are sacked, their archives burned in place, letters still sitting in ovens that were never emptied. Different regions, different cultures, but when you line up the archaeological layers, you see similar fingerprints. You see burned palaces and smashed storage jars. You see hastily built fortifications and weapon hoards. You see evidence of drought and crop failure. You see trade networks that used to stretch from the Black Sea to Egypt, suddenly fragmenting into local economies. Scholars reach for the same bundle of explanations over and over again. Climate change, invasions, internal rebellion, earthquake storms, systems failure. With the Hittites, you have cuneiform tablets begging for grain, hinting at years of poor harvests. Paleoclimate data from tree rings and sediment cores suggests a period of drying and cooling across the eastern Mediterranean, right around the time their empire falls apart. On top of that, there's evidence of enemy attacks on their western territories, pressure from migrating groups, and potential palace coups at the centre. No single thing clearly kills the Hittite Empire. Instead, it looks like a state pushed past its resilience threshold by too many overlapping stresses. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean story is similar but not identical. You get near simultaneous destructions at several palatial centres. Some are rebuilt in a weaker, more localised form. Others are simply abandoned. Linear B disappears. Long-distance trade in luxuries and copper-tin bronze collapses. For a while, you get smaller, poorer communities living in or near the ruins of the old palaces, reusing stones from migurons and storerooms to build simple houses or terraces. Again, explanations pile up. Were the Mycenaeans overextended, running a top-heavy palace economy that couldn't handle a few bad harvests? Did internal elites turn on each other, burning rival centres? Did raiders from outside, possibly some of the groups later labelled Sea Peoples, attack coastal palaces and sea lanes, cutting off vital trade? Did earthquakes play a role, as they almost certainly did on Crete? The honest answer is probably some of all of this, in shifting proportions depending on the site. And in that sense, the Minoan collapse fits the pattern perfectly. A complex, centralised, palace-based system that depends on long-distance trade and careful management of surpluses takes a series of hits: environmental shocks, physical destruction, social unrest, and external pressure. It copes for a while, rebuilds, shifts power centres, then finally crosses a tipping point, and the old order can't be put back together. But the Minoan story is also different in a few crucial ways. First, timing. The main phase of Minoan palace destruction and Mycenaean takeover happens in the 15th century BC, a good 3 centuries before the famous 1200 BC crash. That means we're not dealing with one single pan-Mediterranean apocalyptic event. We're looking at a recurring vulnerability built into how Bronze Age palace societies work. Crete stumbles first in the wake of Thera and all the cascading disruptions we've talked about. The Mycenaeans step into that vacuum. Then, generations later, the Mycenaean system itself runs into its own perfect storm and collapses in turn. Second, nature of the end. On the mainland and in Hittite territory, the palaces don't morph smoothly into new regimes. They burn, they're abandoned, literacy vanishes, and for a long stretch you get fewer, smaller, simpler sites. In some areas it really does look like a dark age, a substantial loss of complexity and connectivity. On Crete, the end of the classic Minoan palaces leads not to an empty island, but to a rebranded one. Knossos survives as an administrative centre under Mycenaean control. Linear B replaces Linear A. Some Minoan religious sites keep functioning, but with Mycenaean touches. The collapse of independent Minoan civilization becomes someone else's opportunity, not a total regional blackout. That makes the Minoan case both more complicated and more revealing. It shows what a soft collapse can look like. Political autonomy lost, old elites displaced, cultural forms altered, but much of the underlying population and landscape still in use, folded into a new system. Third, and maybe most distinctive, the presence of Thera. Most late Bronze Age collapses don't come with a single spectacular, named geological apocalypse attached. With the Minoans, we have this enormous volcanic eruption right next door, an event you can point to on a map and say, this changed things. That's tempting. It invites us to treat Minoan Crete as a special case, the civilization destroyed by a volcano, rather than as one manifestation of broader structural weaknesses shared by many Bronze Age societies. Comparative study pushes back against that temptation. When you zoom out and lay Crete alongside Hattusa, Mycenae, Ugarit and Ramesses III's Egypt, certain themes stand out. All of these systems are highly specialized and interconnected. They depend on predictable climate for agriculture, stable trade routes for bronze and luxuries, and a relatively peaceful political environment for bureaucratic redistribution to work. They build palaces instead of flexible, redundant local institutions. They centralize authority and resources in a few nodes, a capital, a handful of storage complexes, a limited elite. That centralization is efficient in good times. It's catastrophic when shocks hit. Ash clouds, droughts, earthquake sequences, locust plagues, enemy raids, none of these are new. What changes in the Late Bronze Age is how tightly everything is wired together. Lose one palace, and you don't just lose a king, you lose the archive that tracks grain, the storerooms that buffer bad harvests, the workshops that produce weapons, the ritual centre that legitimizes power. On Crete, the Thera eruption, earthquakes and Mycenaean ambition combined to smash that integrated structure earlier than elsewhere. On the mainland and in Anatolia, different combinations of drought, warfare, migration, and internal revolt to do the same job a few centuries later. Historians use these comparisons to calibrate their theories. If they see climate stress and social unrest everywhere at 1200 BC, they're more likely to take seriously the idea that climate and internal tensions also mattered on Crete, not just the flashy volcano. If they notice that many palace systems collapse without a major eruption in sight, they become skeptical of any Minoan explanation that treats Thera as a single, all-sufficient cause. On the other hand, when they study places like Egypt, where the state weathers the 1200 BC storm bruised but alive, they ask, what made the difference? More flexible administration? Different geography? Better access to the Nile's relatively stable water supply? Those questions bounce back onto Crete. Did Minoan palaces have less redundancy, fewer internal checks, more dependence on overseas trade than their neighbours? Did that make them especially fragile when the sea itself turned hostile? The more we compare, the clearer one thing becomes. The Minoan collapse isn't an isolated mystery box sealed off in the Aegean. It's one chapter in a longer Mediterranean story about how complex societies rise, entangle themselves with their neighbours and their climate, and sometimes fail in surprisingly similar ways. And that perspective cuts both ways. It explains why Minoan Crete might have been doomed once enough stresses lined up. But it also forces us to admit how much of the story we still don't fully understand. Because for every shared pattern across the Late Bronze Age, there are local quirks, contingent events, individual choices that shaped exactly how each civilization fell. On Crete, those choices and quirks are buried in ruins we can see, and in writing we still can't read. To bring the mystery into focus, we have to go back to the source that refuses to speak, the undeciphered voice of the Minoans themselves, frozen in clay as Linear A. So where does that leave us? We've spent this episode walking through the main suspects in the Minoan disappearance, and the truth is, every one of them leaves fingerprints on the crime scene. The volcano at Thera clearly mattered. The tsunami deposits, the ash traces, the disruption to trade routes in the Aegean, none of that is imaginary. A blast that big will twist climate patterns, hammer coastal settlements, and terrify anyone who watches half a mountain vanish into the sky. But the archaeological layers on Crete won't let us just stamp "killed by volcano" and walk away. Too many palaces burn at the wrong time. Too many sites show signs of recovery in between. The timelines don't line up neatly enough to make Thera the single silver bullet explanation. Earthquakes are just as real. Crete sits on a tectonic fault, and the evidence for repeated seismic damage in Minoan architecture is overwhelming. Collapsed staircases, shifted foundations, hastily patched walls. You can imagine generation after generation rebuilding, shoring up, adding buttresses. A civilization literally living on shaky ground. But earthquakes had always been there. They don't suddenly appear in 1450 BC. To turn tremors into collapse, you need a society already under strain. That's where internal weaknesses and outside pressure start to loom larger. A palace system that concentrates power and food in a few big storage complexes. Local elites who might be tempted to gamble for the throne when disaster hits. Mycenaean rivals across the water with their own ambitions and their own crises. Linear B tablets from later periods show Mycenaean administrators firmly in charge at Knossos. Weapons caches and burned layers hint at violence, but not always the kind of wholesale massacre popular imagination expects. So historians keep circling back to some version of the perfect storm. A major eruption nearby, a sequence of earthquakes, possible tsunamis, years of disrupted harvests and trade, social tensions inside the palaces, opportunistic intervention from Mycenaean mainlanders. None of these forces alone has to be decisive. Together, over a few generations, they can push a finely tuned system past the point of no return. And yet, for all the scientific firepower we throw at this radiocarbon calibration curves, ice cores from Greenland, microscopic ash layers in lake mud, 3D reconstructions of ruined palaces, the story refuses to snap into a single clean line. New methods shift the ground under our feet every decade. High-precision dating nudges the eruption of Thera up or down by a few decades, and suddenly half the old arguments have to be rewritten. Underwater archaeology finds a wreck with Minoan-style cargo in a place we didn't expect, and our mental map of Bronze Age trade redraws overnight. Ancient DNA from human remains at Cretan cemeteries reveals population continuity where we once assumed drastic replacement, or hints of newcomers where we thought the story was purely local. Even satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar are changing the game, picking up buried buildings, field systems and harbour works that were invisible a generation ago. Each new line of evidence adds details, sharpens some corners, blurs others. The picture gets richer, not simpler, which is probably why the fall of the Minoans keeps pulling us back. It sits right at the intersection of everything that makes the past feel both distant and strangely familiar. A sophisticated maritime culture, deeply religious, obsessed with ritual and display, plugged into far-flung trade networks, undone not by a single villain, but by a tangle of environmental shock, political fragility, and human choice. It's alien enough to feel mythic, close enough to our own globalized, climate-stressed world to feel like a warning. We also can't shake the sense that if we could just crack Linear A, the Minoans might tell us their side. Was Thera spoken of as divine punishment, or barely mentioned at all? Were Mycenaeans cursed as invaders, or recorded as in-laws and partners before things went sour? Did palace scribes note failed harvests, restless subjects, strange omens in the sky? For now, all of that is locked away in signs we can copy but not understand. So we're left reading ash layers, fault lines, and collapsed staircases like a detective reading the outlines of a burned letter. That's where you come in. You've heard the main contenders, the volcano and its tsunamis, the earthquakes and slow erosion of palace power, the Mycenaean takeover, and the idea that it wasn't one disaster at all, but a long, uneven unravelling. Which combination do you find most convincing? If you had to bet on a scenario, or invent your own mix of causes, what does your version of the Minoan endgame look like? Drop your theory in the comments, and while you're there, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing these timelines and locations stack up, little dots from all over the world connecting back to an island in the Bronze Age Aegean. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a civilization that vanished but never quite let go of our imagination, remember to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who still thinks Atlantis every time they hear the word Minoan. And if you want to really support the show, the best way is to listen on Spotify. There's a link waiting for you in the description. That helps more than anything to keep these long-form histories going. The ashes of Thera have settled. The palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea are ruins. But the mystery they left behind is still very much alive, written in stone, clay, and unanswered questions, and we're still trying to read it.